Hello there and welcome to our channel, where curiosity gets comfortable, ideas stretch their legs, and science takes the long, scenic route toward rest. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. There's no destination marked on the map, no stopwatch ticking in the background, and no need to keep one eye on the clock. This is a place for slow thinking, wandering questions, and the kind of wondering that feels less like effort and more like drifting. This time, our gentle thought experiment begins with land. Not borders or flags or names written in atlases, but land itself. Vast, ancient, patient. Continents floating across the surface of the planet like enormous slow-moving rafts carrying mountains, rivers, forests, and eventually us. And the question we'll be turning over carefully and unhurriedly is a simple one on the surface, though it opens many quiet doors once you step inside it. What if each continent had developed its own civilization entirely on its own? No intercontinental travel, no shared myths, no borrowed tools or imported ideas, just land, climate, time, and human minds learning the world one place at a time. It's the sort of question that doesn't demand an answer right away. It prefers to sit with you for a while, the way a good thought often does. Because when you imagine civilizations growing separately, shaped only by their landscapes and skis, you start to notice how deeply geography already guides the way we live. Mountains don't just block movement. They shape stories. Oceans don't merely separate land. They influence how people imagine distance, risk, and the unknown. A frozen horizon teaches different lessons than a burning desert. A forest that never seems to end whispers different ideas than a flat, open plain. Before we go any further, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Not just the country or the city, but the room, the light, the time of day or night. Maybe you're listening from somewhere quiet, or maybe there's a low hum of life continuing nearby. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what does the land look like there, if you were to step outside and keep walking long enough? Hills, coastline, streets layered over ancient ground. It's a small question, but it's already part of the story. If this kind of slow exploration feels comforting, or if you enjoy letting your mind wander without needing to arrive anywhere in particular, you're very welcome here. And if you feel like it, liking the video or subscribing helps this calm little corner reach others who might need a gentle pause, too. No pressure, just an open invitation. The same way this topic is an invitation rather than a demand. Now imagine winding the clock back far beyond recorded history. Before maps had neat edges and names. Before anyone thought of the world as something you could divide neatly. The continents were already there. Of course, though they didn't look exactly as they do now. They had already drifted, collided, and settled into their long, slow dance. Humans, meanwhile, were doing something much faster. Learning, adapting, experimenting, carrying knowledge not in books or data centers but in hands, voices, and memory. In the world we know, those early human paths eventually crossed oceans and land bridges. Ideas traveled with people, tools spread, stories mixed, techniques improved because someone somewhere else had already tried something similar and found a better way. But if we gently remove that mixing, if we imagine a planet where each continent becomes its own closed system for civilization, something interesting happens. Progress no longer looks like a single ladder everyone climbs together. It becomes several parallel journeys, each responding to different problems, different resources, and different rhythms of life. Think about how much of modern civilization depends on comparison. Faster than this, better than that, borrowed from here, improved over there. Without that constant reference point, cultures wouldn't know they were early or late, advanced or behind. They would simply be appropriate to their place. A tool wouldn't be judged by whether it matched something elsewhere, but by whether it worked here. A belief wouldn't need to compete with alternatives. It would only need to make sense under this sky, on this soil, through this cycle of seasons. Even the idea of civilization itself would take on a quieter meaning. No single definition, no shared checklist, just people organizing life in ways that felt stable enough to last, flexible enough to survive, and meaningful enough to pass on. On one continent, civilization might center on rivers that flood predictably. On another, it might form around migration routes that shift year to year. Somewhere else, it might revolve around surviving extremes, cold or heat, so relentless that cooperation becomes less a moral choice and more a basic requirement. Without contact between continents, knowledge would accumulate differently. Metallurgy might arise early in places with accessible ores and abundant fuel, while remaining unknown elsewhere where stone, bone, or wood solve problems just as effectively. Writing might develop in regions where record-keeping becomes essential, while oral traditions grow extraordinarily complex in places where memory and storytelling are more useful than marks on a surface. Mathematics might lean toward astronomy and wide-open landscapes, or toward architecture in areas where building against gravity becomes a daily concern, and language itself would drift into entirely different shapes. Without shared roots spreading across continents, the sounds, structures, and rhythms of speech would respond to environment as much as culture. Dense forests might favor shorter calls and layered tones. Open plains might encourage long-distance projection. Harsh climates might compress language into efficiency, while stable environments allow it to expand, embellish, and play. None of this would be deliberate. It would simply happen slowly, as generations adjusted to what worked. As these isolated civilizations developed, they wouldn't think of themselves as isolated. They would think of themselves as complete. The world would feel whole, not because it was fully known, but because there would be no sense that something vital lay beyond the horizon. The ocean wouldn't represent another place filled with other people. It would be a boundary of meaning, a place where stories fade into speculation rather than geography. It's worth pausing here because this idea challenges a habit we've grown used to. We often imagine history as a single unfolding narrative, with different regions contributing chapters that eventually merge. But separated civilizations invite us to imagine history as several independent conversations happening at once, none of them aware of the others, none of them missing anything they don't know exists. Conflict would still arise. Of course, scarcity doesn't disappear just because continents are separate. Neither does disagreement, ambition, or fear. But the reasons for conflict would be entirely local. No wars over trade routes that span oceans. No ideological clashes imported from distant lands. Every tension would grow from the immediate landscape, the available resources, and the social structures that formed around them. Time itself might feel different. Without synchronization across continents, calendars would be deeply local. Some societies might measure time primarily by seasons, others by animal migrations, others by the movement of stars that dominate their particular skies. Even the length of a day or year would be experienced differently depending on latitude. The idea of a universal schedule would never arise. Punctuality would mean something different everywhere, or perhaps very little at all. As these civilizations matured, they would develop philosophies that reflected not abstract universals, but lived reality. A desert civilization might see permanence as illusion and movement as truth. A forest civilization might view interconnectedness as obvious rather than aspirational. A civilization shaped by earthquakes or volcanoes might place uncertainty at the center of its worldview, not as anxiety, but as acceptance. And through all of this, humanity would still be recognizably human. Children would learn by watching elders. Songs would mark important moments. Tools would be refined not because someone elsewhere had done better, but because someone here noticed a small improvement. There would be humor, frustration, affection, loss. The same emotional palette painted with different colors depending on the land. What's especially interesting is that without intercontinental contact, the idea of progress itself would be quieter. There would be no race, no sense of falling behind or pulling ahead. Each civilization would move at the pace demanded by its environment and choices. Some might change rapidly. Others might remain stable for thousands of years, not because they were incapable of change, but because change offered no clear advantage. As you let this idea settle, you might notice how much of our modern identity depends on comparison, on knowing what exists elsewhere, on imagining alternatives we could adopt or avoid. Stripping that away doesn't make civilizations smaller. In many ways, it makes them deeper, more rooted, less anxious about alignment with a global standard that never truly fits anyone perfectly anyway. And while this is still just the beginning of the thought experiment, already the planet starts to feel different, larger, quieter, more plural. Not a single story unfolding unevenly, but several stories unfolding fully, each convinced quite reasonably that they are the story of the world. Long before anyone had words for continents, before there were names to place on maps or lines to argue over, the planet was already telling a slow story beneath everything living on its surface. The ground itself was not fixed. It never has been. What feels solid underfoot is on a deeper time scale patient and restless at the same time. Stone flows, plates slide, oceans open and close like long unhurried breaths. And while human lives pass in decades, and even civilizations rise and fade within a few thousand years, the land beneath them is working on a schedule so large that change feels invisible until suddenly it isn't. There was a time when the continents were not continents at all, at least not in the way we think of them now. They were gathered together in vast supercontinents, joined edge to edge, sharing mountain ranges, rivers, climates, and ecosystems. Animals could wander from what we now call Africa into what we now call South America without ever touching water. Forests stretched across regions that are today separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The planet was arranged differently, not just geographically, but experientially. Life adapted to those arrangements, and for a long while, they were stable enough to feel permanent. Then, very slowly, the separations began. Tectonic plates shifted, driven by heat deep within the Earth, by forces that do not care about surface life, but nonetheless shape it completely. Cracks formed. Rifts widened. Land that had once been continuous began to pull apart. Water rushed in, not all at once but steadily, filling the spaces left behind. What would become ocean started as narrow seams, then grew broader over millions of years. To anything living at the time, the changes were gradual enough to be almost unnoticeable from one generation to the next. No one woke up one morning to find the sea suddenly blocking a familiar path. Instead, coastlines crept outward, climates shifted, and routes that were once easy slowly became more difficult, then impossible. As land masses drifted apart, so did the living systems on them. Plants, animals, and eventually humans found themselves increasingly confined to particular regions, adapting to local conditions rather than shared ones. Evolution, which already works through isolation and variation, leaned into this separation. Species diverged. Ecosystems specialized. What survived in one place vanished in another. Over time, each land mass became its own laboratory, running long experiments shaped by temperature, rainfall, soil, and chance. Humans entered this story relatively late. But when they did, they carried something no other species had in quite the same way. They carried stories, not just tales told for entertainment, but frameworks for understanding the world. Ways of explaining why the land behaved as it did, why the sky looked the way it looked, why certain places felt safe and others dangerous. These stories traveled with people as long as movement was possible. But as the land itself made movement harder, those stories began to settle. Imagine early human groups spreading across a connected landmass. Knowledge could move with them. Techniques for making tools, strategies for hunting, rituals for marking seasons or loss. But as rifts widened and seas deepened, those shared traditions began to lose contact with one another. A group on one side of a widening channel might continue a practice that elsewhere slowly changed or disappeared. Over generations, a once shared story would become two similar but distinct versions, then eventually two entirely different narratives, each shaped by its own landscape and challenges. This wasn't a dramatic split. There were no announcements, no sense of something being lost. For the people living through it, the world still felt whole. They still knew everything there was to know about their surroundings. The horizon was the same distance it had always been. What changed was not awareness, but possibility. Paths that had once been taken stopped being taken. Encounters that had once been possible stopped happening. And without contact, divergence became the default. As continents separated further, isolation became more complete. Oceans are not just barriers of water. They are barriers of scale, unpredictability, and risk. Crossing them requires technology, planning, and motivation. Without strong reasons to attempt such crossings, and without knowledge of what lay beyond, early societies remained landbound. Their world was defined by what could be reached on foot, by boat along familiar coasts, or eventually by rivers that acted as long, winding roads through interior landscapes. In this imagined world, where continents remain isolated far longer than they did in our own history, the separation becomes permanent enough to shape civilization itself. Each land mass becomes not just a place where people live, but the entirety of the known world. The idea that there might be other lands beyond the ocean does not vanish entirely, but it remains speculative, mythic, untestable. Stories about distant places exist, but they are stories, not geography. They are populated by spirits, ancestors, or abstract forces, not other societies with comparable complexity. Over long periods of isolation, human cultures begin to mirror the rhythms of their environments more closely. Without external comparison, there is no pressure to align with foreign ideas of efficiency, hierarchy, or progress. Solutions evolve locally. If a way of organizing food production works well enough, it persists. If a belief system helps explain floods, droughts, or migrations in a way that encourages cooperation, it remains. There is no sense that things could or should be done differently, because no alternative is visible. Language, which is already sensitive to isolation, becomes deeply regional. Sounds, grammar, and meaning drift in response to environment and social structure. Over tens of thousands of years, languages on separate continents would share no common roots at all. They would not just be mutually unintelligible. They would be conceptually different. Some might lack words for certain directions because the landscape makes them irrelevant. Others might encode time in ways that reflect seasonal cycles rather than linear progression. Without contact, there is no convergence, only branching. The same applies to technology. In a connected world, useful inventions spread. In an isolated one, they either arise independently or not at all. Fire, once discovered, is unlikely to be lost. But other technologies are more contingent. Agriculture might emerge in some places and never in others, depending on available plants and animals. Metallurgy might flourish where ores are accessible and stagnate where stone and organic materials suffice. Navigation technology might remain rudimentary in places where coastlines are simple and inland resources abundant. What's important is that none of these outcomes imply inferiority or superiority. They are simply different responses to different constraints. A civilization that never develops metal tools is not necessarily less capable. It may develop extraordinary expertise in materials that others overlook. A society without large cities may organize itself through networks of seasonal movement rather than permanent structures. Complexity does not vanish. It shifts. As the land masses continue to drift, climates change with them. A continent that once sat close to the equator may move toward cooler latitudes. Rain patterns alter. Forests shrink or expand. Deserts form. These changes happen slowly enough that societies adapt incrementally. Practices adjust. Stories evolve. What was once explained as the will of spirits may later be understood as a recurring pattern, then eventually woven into ritual or calendar. Over time, civilizations become deeply tuned to long-term environmental trends, even if they lack formal scientific language to describe them. Because these changes are slow, memory plays a crucial role. Oral traditions preserve knowledge of past conditions, past disasters, past migrations. In the absence of written records, memory becomes infrastructure. Stories are not entertainment alone. They are archives. They encode survival strategies, warnings, and ethical frameworks. When continents are isolated, these story systems grow more intricate, more locally optimized because they are the primary means of continuity. As generations pass, the separation of land masses also shapes how people think about belonging. Identity becomes inseparable from place, not just culturally, but cosmologically. The land is not one region among many. It is the world. The sky above it is the sky. The animals, plants, and features of that land are not examples of broader categories. They are the categories themselves. This has a grounding effect on worldview. Abstractions are fewer. Meaning is anchored in immediate experience. Without awareness of other continents, there is no global scale for comparison. Ambition is measured differently. There is no concept of world dominance, no idea of expansion across oceans to acquire distant resources. Conflict, when it occurs, is local and finite. It arises from competition over land, water, or status within a shared environment, not from ideological clashes between fundamentally different ways of life. This isolation also influences how societies imagine time. Without synchronized calendars or shared historical milestones, timekeeping remains tied to local cycles, seasons, migrations, celestial patterns specific to a given latitude. History is not placed on a universal timeline, but remembered as sequences of events tied to places. The past is not something that happened everywhere at once. It is something that happened here. As the continents continue drifting, their skis even begin to differ. Star patterns visible in one hemisphere are not visible in another. Without intercontinental contact, astronomy develops independently. Constellations are mapped differently. The same stars may exist, but their meanings diverge. Stories attached to the night sky become another point of separation, reinforcing distinct cosmologies that feel complete within themselves. At this stage in the thought experiment, the planet is no longer just physically divided. It is conceptually divided. Each continent carries not only its own ecosystems and climates, but its own assumptions about reality. What is considered normal? What is considered possible? What is considered sacred? These assumptions are not challenged by external alternatives. They deepen, refine, and stabilize. And yet none of this implies stagnation. Change still happens. Innovation still occurs. Ideas still evolve. They simply do so without reference to parallel developments elsewhere. This creates civilizations that are internally coherent, deeply adapted, and largely uninterested in hypothetical alternatives beyond their lived experience. As we linger here in this long period where land masses have drifted far enough apart to make shared development impossible, it becomes clear that geography is not just a backdrop to civilization. It is an active participant. It shapes not only what people can do, but what they can imagine. When land separates, imagination narrows and deepens at the same time. When you imagine the beginning of human civilization in this separated world, there is a quiet inevitability to where the story settles first. Not because of symbolism or mythology, but because of evidence written into bones, tools, and the ground itself. Africa is not just another continent in this thought experiment. It is the place where human history starts before it has words for itself. Long before cities, before agriculture, before calendars and monuments, There are people living, adapting, learning, and passing knowledge forward. Here, in a world where continents never reconnect, Africa does not become a shared origin remembered faintly by distant societies. It becomes a complete and self-contained memory of humanity's beginning, carried forward entirely within its own land. This matters more than it might seem at first. When a civilization knows, even implicitly, that its entire past is rooted in the same land it inhabits now, continuity takes on a different texture. There is no ancestral elsewhere, no lost homeland across the sea, no migration myths pointing outward toward a forgotten origin. The land itself becomes the archive. Hills, valleys, and river systems hold not just resources, but memory, layered slowly over tens of thousands of years. Africa's environmental diversity plays a central role in shaping how this civilization develops. It is not a single landscape repeating endlessly. It contains deserts that demand restraint and foresight, forests that reward attentiveness, savas that favor movement and observation, and coastlines that offer abundance, but also uncertainty. Each region supports different ways of living, but all exist within a connected continental system. People move, but they do not leave the world. They relocate within it. Because humans evolve and remain here without intercontinental dispersal, adaptation happens inward rather than outward. Techniques refine locally. Social structures respond to regional conditions rather than external comparison. Over long periods, networks of exchange form across the continent, not to import novelty, but to balance variability. Drought in one region is offset by surplus in another. Knowledge of seasonal cycles travels along river corridors. Oral histories encode patterns of movement, cooperation, and survival that span generations. Without the pressure or possibility of leaving the continent, attention turns toward understanding it deeply. Africa becomes not a stepping stone, but a destination in itself. People learn how rainfall shifts over decades. They notice subtle changes in animal behavior that signal environmental stress. They refine land use practices that preserve soil rather than exhaust it. Not out of ideology, but because exhaustion has immediate consequences when there is nowhere else to go. Over time, this produces a civilization with an unusually long memory. Not written at first, but carried in story, ritual, and practice. Elders are not simply respected for age. They are valued as living repositories of accumulated understanding. Stories are told not to entertain children, but to teach them how to read the land. A tale about a wandering ancestor is also a lesson about migration routes during dry seasons. A myth about a trickster animal is also a warning about overconfidence in unfamiliar terrain. Because Africa contains both stability and volatility, belief systems develop that emphasize balance rather than control. Floods and droughts occur sometimes predictably, sometimes not. Volcanic regions remind people that the ground itself can change. Rather than seeking mastery over nature, many societies develop frameworks that emphasize alignment, timing, and respect. The land is not something to be conquered. It is something to be listened to. Technology reflects this orientation. Tools are refined for durability and adaptability, rather than specialization alone. A spear is not just a weapon. It is a multi-purpose extension of the body, useful for hunting, defense, and signaling. Containers are designed to preserve water over long distances. Shelters are built to respond to heat during the day and cold at night. Innovation emerges from necessity, but it is guided by restraint rather than excess. Language developing entirely within this continental context becomes rich in spatial and environmental reference. Directions may be given relative to rivers, prevailing winds, or the sun's position at different times of year. Time is often described in relation to natural events rather than abstract units. A journey takes as long as it takes the shadows to shorten and lengthen again. A season begins when certain birds return or when particular plants flower. This keeps human activity synchronized with ecological rhythms rather than detached from them. As populations grow and settle more permanently in fertile regions, social organization becomes more complex. Villages expand into towns, trade networks widen, craft specialization increases. But even as complexity grows, it does not overwrite memory. New practices are layered onto old ones. Farming does not erase foraging knowledge. Permanent settlements do not eliminate seasonal movement entirely. Redundancy becomes a strength. When one system fails, another remains. In this isolated continental world, Africa develops early forms of agriculture suited to its climates. Domestication occurs gradually, shaped by local species rather than imported models. Crops are selected not just for yield, but for resilience. Animals are integrated into social life in ways that reflect long familiarity rather than rapid exploitation. The relationship between people and domesticated species remains negotiated rather than hierarchical. This has consequences for how hierarchy develops. Leadership tends to be situational rather than absolute. Those who know the land best during drought may hold influence then, while others lead during times of abundance or conflict. Authority is linked to competence and experience rather than abstract power. While inequality still exists, it is tempered by interdependence. No group can afford to cedize completely when survival depends on shared knowledge and mutual support. Art too reflects long continuity. Cave paintings, carvings, body adornment, and music emerge not as isolated expressions, but as part of a living tradition. Symbols evolve slowly. Motifs repeat with variation across regions. A pattern carved into stone echoes one painted on skin, which echoes one sung in rhythm. Meaning is not fixed, but it is not arbitrary either. It accumulates through repetition and adaptation. As metallurgy eventually develops in regions with accessible ores, it does not trigger sudden rupture. Metal tools coexist with older technologies. They're adopted where they offer clear advantage and ignored where they do not. There is no pressure to standardize across the continent. Diversity persists because it works. Different solutions solve different problems equally well because Africa does not export people to other continents in this world. It does not experience the drain of constant outward migration. Population pressure is managed internally through movement, adaptation, and social negotiation. Conflicts arise as they always do, but they are resolved within a shared cultural framework that recognizes long-term coexistence as unavoidable. There is no imagined elsewhere to escape to permanently. This creates a deep sense of temporal grounding. The past is not distant or abstract. It is visible in the land and in practice. Ancestors are not mythic founders separated by oceans and eras. They are remembered as people who walked these same paths, drank from the same rivers, and faced similar uncertainties. Continuity is not idealized. It is practical. Over thousands of years, Africa becomes not just a cradle of humanity, but a sustained human world, evolving without interruption, without the sharp discontinuities caused by intercontinental upheaval. Its civilizations rise and fall, but always within a shared continental memory. Collapse in one region does not erase the whole. Knowledge persists elsewhere and eventually returns. What emerges from this is a civilization that does not measure itself against others. It does not see itself as early or late. It simply is. Its sense of identity is not derived from comparison, but from duration. Being here longer than anywhere else matters, not as a claim of superiority, but as a source of confidence. There is a quiet understanding that humanity has always belonged here and always adapted here. As time passes, the idea of the world beyond the surrounding seas remains distant and undefined. Stories may speculate about lands across the water, but they carry no urgency. There is enough complexity, challenge, and meaning within the continent itself. Exploration focuses inward toward deeper understanding rather than outward conquest. This inward focus shapes how Africa's civilizations understand knowledge itself. Learning is cumulative but not linear. Progress does not replace the past. It incorporates it. A new farming method does not erase old gathering practices. A new social structure does not invalidate ancestral wisdom. Instead, systems stack and interlock, creating resilience through overlap. By the time other continents, isolated in their own ways, are developing their own distinct civilizations, Africa is already operating with a profound sense of temporal depth. It does not see history as something that began recently or accelerated suddenly. History is continuous, textured, and always present. Europe, in this separated world, never thinks of itself as a crossroads. There are no distant continents pressing in from every direction, no steady stream of outside ideas arriving by ship or caravan. Instead, Europe grows inward, shaped by a landscape that rarely settles into one stable pattern for long. Coastlines fracture into peninsulas and islands. Mountain ranges divide valleys into pockets. Rivers run in different directions, pulling communities apart as often as they draw them together. The land itself encourages fragmentation, and fragmentation over time encourages a very particular habit of mind. Here, civilization does not develop as a single continuous arc. It develops as a series of experiments. Europe's climate is neither reliably gentle nor consistently harsh. Seasons shift dramatically. Winters can be punishing, summers brief and precious. Storms arrive without ceremony. Crops thrive one year and fail the next. In such an environment, permanence is difficult to achieve and rarely trusted. Early societies learn quickly that what works now may not work later, and that survival depends less on preserving a single system than on being able to adjust when conditions change. This breeds a culture that becomes comfortable with revision. Practices are tested, modified, abandoned, and reintroduced in new forms. Settlements rise, reorganize, and sometimes disperse only to reform elsewhere. Knowledge is valued, but not because it is ancient. It is valued because it is adaptable. Elders are respected, but so are innovators, tinkerers, and those willing to question arrangements that no longer fit the present moment. Without intercontinental contact, Europe never inherits external templates for governance, religion, or technology. Everything that develops here does so through internal iteration. A method spreads from one valley to another, encounters resistance or modification, then splinters into variants. Over centuries, this produces not uniformity, but layers of overlapping approaches. No single system dominates for long enough to feel inevitable. Geography reinforces this tendency. Mountains isolate communities just enough to let ideas diverge, but not so completely that contact disappears. Rivers act as corridors of exchange, but they do not unify the entire continent into a single rhythm. The result is a patchwork of societies that share certain broad concerns, but answer them differently. How to manage land, how to distribute surplus, how to resolve disputes. Each region tries, fails, adjusts, and tries again. Because Europe's resources are unevenly distributed, trade becomes essential early on. Not global trade, but regional exchange. Salt from one area moves inland. Timber from forested regions travels toward open plains. Metal ores circulate where they can be accessed. These networks do more than move goods. They move ideas, though slowly and imperfectly, and innovation arrives, stripped of its original context, adapted to new conditions, and often transformed beyond recognition. Over time, this produces a cultural expectation that no solution is final. Laws are revised, traditions are debated, beliefs evolve through interpretation rather than rigid preservation. This does not mean Europe lacks continuity. It means continuity expresses itself through change rather than stasis. Stories are retold with alterations. Rituals shift emphasis. Symbols accumulate meanings rather than locking into one definition. Conflict, when it arises, often accelerates reinvention. Competing groups experiment with different ways of organizing defense, labor, or leadership. Some approaches prove effective and spread. Others collapse and are remembered as cautionary tales. Because there is no external power to impose order, stability must be earned repeatedly. Authority is rarely absolute for long. It is negotiated, contested, and restructured. Religion develops in a similarly iterative way. Early belief systems are closely tied to landscape. Mountains are sacred, not as abstractions, but as weather makers and barriers. Forests are places of both provision and danger. Rivers are lifelines and boundaries. As societies grow more complex, these beliefs are reinterpreted rather than discarded. New layers of meaning are added, often reflecting social change. Deities merge, split, or fade. Moral systems shift focus as economic structures evolve. Writing, once it emerges, does not freeze tradition. It multiplies versions. Texts are copied, commented on, revised. Different regions preserve different interpretations. Disagreement becomes normalized. The idea that truth might be approached through argument rather than inherited whole becomes culturally acceptable. This does not eliminate conflict, but it channels it into structured debate as often as violence. Europe's long winters contribute to this inward focus. Periods of enforced stillness encourage reflection, planning, and storytelling. When movement is limited, attention turns to ideas. Discussions stretch long into nights. Hypotheticals are explored. Systems are imagined, criticized, and refined before being tested when conditions allow. Thought becomes a form of preparation. Technological development follows a similar pattern. Tools are adapted repeatedly to local needs. A plow designed for heavy soil is useless in rocky terrain and must be redesigned. Housing changes shape depending on climate and available materials. No single architectural style dominates because no single solution fits everywhere. Builders learn to improvise, borrowing elements and recombining them. As urban centers emerge, they do not grow in isolation from their surroundings. Cities depend heavily on surrounding regions for food and resources. When those relationships strain, cities decline or reorganize. This creates a cyclical understanding of growth. Expansion is expected to peak and contract. Decline is not necessarily seen as failure, but as part of a larger rhythm that makes space for renewal. Education, where it formalizes, reflects this mindset. Rather than transmitting fixed doctrine, it emphasizes method. How to think, how to argue, how to adapt known principles to unfamiliar problems. Apprenticeship systems value learning by doing, by correcting mistakes, by refining techniques over time. Mastery is not defined as perfection, but as responsiveness. Without external benchmarks, Europe never imagines itself as a standard against which others should be measured. It does not see its ways as universal. They are simply the ways that have worked here so far. This fosters a certain humility, though not always consciously. There is an underlying expectation that circumstances may change again, requiring further adjustment. Political organization remains fluid. Empires rise, but they rarely endure without modification. Centralization brings efficiency, but also brittleness. When conditions shift, overly rigid systems fracture. Decentralized arrangements prove resilient, but struggle to coordinate large projects. Over time, hybrid forms emerge, combining local autonomy with shared frameworks, then fragmenting again under new pressures. This repeated cycle of construction, critique, and reconstruction becomes deeply ingrained. It shapes how people understand identity. Being part of a society does not mean belonging to something fixed. It means participating in an ongoing process. Citizenship, in whatever form it takes, is less about inheritance and more about engagement. Art mirrors this restlessness. Styles change frequently, New forms emerge in response to old ones. Imitation exists, but it is rarely exact. Artists reinterpret motifs rather than reproduce them. Even when themes persist, they are reframed to reflect current concerns. There is an expectation that expression should respond to the present rather than merely honor the past. Memory functions differently here than in places with longer environmental stability. Rather than preserving a single origin story, Europe accumulates many. Foundings are remembered, forgotten, and remembered again in altered forms. History is not a straight line, but a layered record of attempts. This produces a complex relationship with the past. It is consulted, argued with, sometimes deliberately contradicted over long periods. This creates a civilization that is unusually tolerant of uncertainty, not because uncertainty is comfortable, but because it is familiar. Plans are made with the expectation that they may need revision. Ideals are held with an awareness of their provisional nature. Even failure is not always terminal. It is often treated as information. This does not mean Europe avoids dogmatism entirely. At times, certain ideas harden and dominate, but the landscape and history conspire against permanent rigidity. New pressures arise, old solutions falter, cracks appear, reform movements gain traction, change resumes. As centuries pass, Europe becomes a place where innovation is not always driven by abundance, but by constraint. Limited growing seasons, fragmented terrain, and frequent environmental challenges force creativity. Efficiency matters, but so does flexibility. Systems that cannot bend tend to break. All of this unfolds without awareness of other continents following their own separate paths. There is no sense of being one civilization among many. There is only the internal diversity of this landmass, with its constant reminders that no arrangement lasts forever. Reinvention is not celebrated as novelty for its own sake. It is accepted as necessity. By the time Europe's societies reach high levels of technical and social complexity, they carry with them this long habit of revision. They do not expect their institutions to endure unchanged. They expect them to be argued over, reworked, and sometimes dismantled. Stability is achieved not by freezing structures in place, but by maintaining the capacity to rebuild. Europe's story continues in motion, not arriving at conclusions, but moving forward through cycles of adaptation that never quite settle, always leaving space for the next adjustment to take shape. Asia, in this world of separated continents, does not experience itself as a place that is constantly beginning again. It experiences itself as something already in motion, long before any one generation arrives to add its weight. The land is vast in ways that are difficult to grasp without living within it. Plains stretch beyond the horizon. Mountain systems rise and fold into one another, not as obstacles to be crossed once, but as presences that shape entire regions for millennia. Rivers run so long and so predictably that they become more than water. They become structure. And within this scale, civilization develops with a strong sense that it is inheriting something already underway. Continuity here is not an abstract idea. It is practical. When a river floods in roughly the same way generation after generation, knowledge accumulates around it. When monsoon patterns repeat with variation but not chaos, calendars take shape around them. When fertile soil renews itself through cycles that outlast individual lives, patience becomes a reasonable strategy. Over time, societies form that are less concerned with rapid reinvention and more concerned with alignment, maintenance, and transmission. Because Asia remains isolated from other continents, its civilizations never feel compelled to justify themselves against outside examples. There is no need to prove superiority or novelty. What matters is whether systems endure. Practices are evaluated over long periods, not short bursts. A method that works for centuries earns trust not because it is old, but because it has demonstrated reliability under changing conditions. This produces an orientation toward time that feels heavy rather than urgent. Decisions are often made with the expectation that consequences will unfold slowly. Planning extends beyond a single lifetime. The idea that one generation might initiate a project whose completion they will never see is not unusual. Roads, irrigation systems, terraces, and institutions are built with future inhabitants in mind. People who are not imagined as strangers, but as continuations. Social organization reflects this depth. Hierarchies form, but they are rarely justified by raw power alone. Authority is often linked to stewardship. Those who govern are expected to preserve balance rather than disrupt it. Change is not forbidden, but it is approached cautiously. Reforms are framed as restorations of proper order rather than breaks from the past. Even when new ideas arise, they are often expressed in the language of continuity. This has a stabilizing effect, but it also creates inertia. Practices that no longer serve everyone persist because they are embedded in long chains of obligation. Challenging them requires not only evidence of failure, but a compelling alternative that can be framed as compatible with inherited values. Innovation happens, but it tends to arrive quietly, folded into existing structures rather than announced as rupture. Belief systems develop accordingly. Rather than focusing on singular moments of creation or final endings, many traditions emphasize cycles. Renewal is expected. Decline is anticipated. The universe is understood as something that moves through phases rather than along a straight line. This worldview offers reassurance during hardship. A poor harvest or political instability is not necessarily a sign of permanent collapse. It may simply be part of a larger pattern that has occurred before and will pass again. Ritual plays a central role in maintaining the sense of continuity. Ceremonies are repeated not because repetition is comforting, but because it reinforces connection across time. To perform a ritual is to participate in a sequence that extends backward and forward beyond the present moment. Even when meaning shifts slightly, the form remains recognizable. This anchors identity in shared action rather than individual interpretation. Writing, once established, becomes a powerful tool for continuity. Records preserve decisions, genealogies, agreements, and observations. Texts are copied meticulously, commented on, and contextualized. Rather than replacing older material, new writing often accumulates alongside it. This creates dense layers of reference. Knowledge is not streamlined. It is preserved in depth. Education reflects this approach. Learning involves mastery of foundational texts, techniques, or principles before experimentation is encouraged. Students are expected to absorb tradition thoroughly so that any deviation is informed rather than accidental. Creativity is not discouraged, but it is expected to emerge from understanding rather than rejection. The scale of the continent also supports large coordinated systems. Extensive irrigation networks require cooperation across regions. Managing them demands administration, record-keeping, and shared standards. Over time, this fosters centralized institutions capable of organizing labor and resources on a massive scale. These institutions persist because they solve real problems, not because they impose abstract order. However, centralization also introduces rigidity. When systems become too large, they can struggle to adapt quickly to unexpected change. Environmental shifts, population pressures, or internal dissent test the resilience of long-standing arrangements. Responses tend to favor restoration over reinvention. Reforms aim to correct deviation rather than redesign structure. Because Asia's civilizations develop without external interruption, their internal diversity becomes more pronounced. Different regions adapt the overarching framework to local conditions. Mountain communities live differently from riverine ones. Coastal societies organize around maritime rhythms. Desert regions develop strategies that emphasize conservation and movement. All exist within a shared civilizational sphere, but none are identical. Language reflects this diversity layered onto continuity. Written forms may remain stable for long periods, preserving mutual intelligibility across distance and time, while spoken varieties shift regionally. This creates a dynamic where tradition feels constant, even as everyday expression evolves. Change happens, but it is often more visible in practice than in formal structure. Art follows a similar pattern. Styles persist, but details vary. Techniques are refined rather than replaced. A motif used centuries ago appears again, slightly altered, responding to new materials or sensibilities. This repetition does not signal stagnation. It signals dialogue across generations. Each artist contributes to a long conversation rather than starting anew. Conflict, when it arises, is often framed as a breakdown of harmony rather than a clash of incompatible values. Resolution aims to restore balance. Even when violence occurs, it is justified as temporary disruption in service of long-term stability. This does not make conflict less severe, but it shapes how it is understood and addressed. Because the continent is so large, complete unification is difficult. Political boundaries shift over time. Empires expand and contract. Yet, even as political forms change, civilizational continuity persists. Administrative systems borrow from predecessors. Legal concepts are adapted rather than discarded. Memory of past governance informs present arrangements. This creates a layered sense of identity. Individuals belong to families, communities, regions, and broader cultural traditions simultaneously. None fully overrides the others. Loyalty is distributed across scales. This complexity can generate tension, but it also provides resilience. When one layer fails, others remain. Time in this context is not something to outrun. It is something to inhabit. The future is not imagined as radically different from the past. It is expected to echo it in new configurations. This shapes expectations around progress. Improvement is incremental. Stability is valued. Sudden transformation is viewed with suspicion, unless it can be justified as necessary realignment. As centuries pass, Asia's civilizations accumulate immense depth. Knowledge systems become sophisticated. Technologies advance steadily. Social structures grow intricate. Yet there is little sense of culmination. There is always more to refine, more to maintain, more to pass on. The weight of continuity presses gently but persistently on each generation, reminding them that they are part of something larger than themselves. This does not mean individual ambition disappears. People still seek distinction, influence, and legacy. But legacy is often defined by contribution to continuity rather than disruption. To be remembered is to have strengthened what endures, not to have shattered it. Asia's story continues to unfold in long arcs. It does not rush toward contact or comparison. It deepens inward, carrying forward the accumulated weight of countless lives lived within the same broad rhythms. North America, in this imagined world of separated continents, never settles into the idea that staying still is the natural state of civilization. From its earliest human presence, movement is not an exception or a disruption. It is the default condition. The land itself encourages it. Vast distances stretch between resource zones. Climate varies sharply across latitude and altitude. Ice advances and retreats over long cycles. Rivers change course. Herds migrate. Forests expand and contract. To live here is to pay attention, not just to place, but to timing. Because no intercontinental contact ever arrives to interrupt or redirect development. This relationship with movement deepens rather than fades. Civilization in North America does not organize itself around fixed centers that assume permanence. Instead, it develops as a network of routes, seasonal hubs, and shifting territories. Stability exists, but it is dynamic rather than static. A place matters not because it is always occupied, but because it is returned to. From the beginning, human groups learn that survival depends on flexibility. Settling permanently in one location, without regard for changing conditions, is risky. Winters can be severe. Droughts can stretch longer than memory expects. A resource-rich area can become temporarily inhospitable, while another opens up unexpectedly. Over generations, knowledge accumulates about when to move, where to go, and how long to stay. This knowledge is precise, detailed, and constantly updated. Stories function as maps more than chronicles. A narrative about an ancestor's journey encodes information about terrain, weather patterns, and timing. A myth about an animal spirit describes migration routes. Songs mark distances not in abstract units, but in days of travel between reliable landmarks. Memory is not anchored to buildings or monuments. It is carried in people and reinforced through repetition on the move. This does not mean North American societies lack complexity. On the contrary, managing movement at scale requires coordination, negotiation, and trust. Groups must align their schedules. Territories must be shared or rotated. Conflict over resources still occurs, but it is shaped by the understanding that boundaries are fluid. Ownership is less absolute and more conditional. Rights to a place are often tied to season, purpose, or lineage rather than permanent exclusion. As populations grow, networks expand rather than condense. Trade routes form along rivers, coastlines, and over mountain passes. Goods move great distances, not because of centralized markets, but because people themselves are already moving. Exchange happens during convergence moments, when groups gather temporarily for ceremonies, hunts, or seasonal abundance. These gatherings serve multiple functions at once. They redistribute resources. They reinforce alliances. They transmit knowledge. They renew social bonds. Technology reflects this orientation. Tools are designed for portability and repair. Housing favors structures that can be assembled, dismantled, or adapted quickly. Clothing is layered and versatile. Containers are lightweight but durable. Excess accumulation is discouraged not through ideology, but through practicality. What cannot be carried must be left behind. So innovation focuses on efficiency rather than volume. This emphasis on movement shapes social identity. Belonging is defined less by fixed residence and more by participation in shared cycles. To be part of a group is to know when and how it moves. Children learn roots as they learn language. Elders are valued not just for age, but for memory of past shifts, past disruptions, and how they were navigated. Leadership often emerges from those who can anticipate change rather than enforce order. Because environments vary so widely across the continent, different movement patterns coexist. In the far north, mobility responds to ice and daylight. In plains regions, it follows grazing animals and weather. Along coasts, it aligns with tides, fish runs, and storms. Forest societies move differently again, tracing paths through dense terrain where visibility is limited and sound carries differently. Each pattern develops its own logic, but all share an underlying assumption that adaptability is essential. Agriculture, where it emerges, does not immediately replace movement. Instead, it integrates with it. Crops are cultivated in locations that fit seasonal cycles. Fields may be tended during part of the year and abandoned during others. Farming becomes another reason to move, not a reason to stop. This creates mixed economies that balance cultivation with hunting, gathering, and trade. Dependence on a single food source is avoided because the land itself teaches caution. Political organization remains decentralized for long periods. Large permanent capitals offer little advantage in a world where people are distributed across wide territories. Authority operates through councils, alliances, and reputation rather than fixed hierarchies. Influence is earned through reliability, generosity, and demonstrated knowledge of routes and seasons. Decisions are often made through consensus, not because agreement is easy, but because fracture during movement can be disastrous. Conflict resolution follows similar logic. Violence is costly when communities are interdependent across shifting landscapes. Feuds risk disrupting shared access to critical resources. As a result, systems develop to contain and resolve disputes through mediation, compensation, or ritualized competition. These systems are not perfect, but they reflect a long understanding that continuity depends on cooperation more than domination. Belief systems mirror this worldview. Rather than emphasizing fixed sacred places alone, spirituality often centers on journeys, thresholds, and transitions. Certain routes are imbued with meaning. Certain moments of arrival or departure are marked as significant. The sacred is encountered not only in temples or shrines, but in the act of moving through the land attentively. Change is not something to fear. It is something to be respected. Time is understood differently as well. Instead of being measured primarily by accumulation, it is measured by cycles of return. A year is not just a sequence of months. It is a loop of movements completed. A life is remembered by the paths taken, the gatherings attended, the routes taught to others. History is spatial as much as temporal. Events are recalled in relation to where they moved afterward. As centuries pass, these patterns become deeply ingrained. Even as technologies improve and populations increase, the preference for flexibility persists. Larger structures are built, but they are often seasonal or ceremonial rather than permanent centers of daily life. Infrastructure supports movement rather than replacing it. Roads follow old paths. Canoes and sleds are refined rather than abandoned. Innovation enhances mobility instead of anchoring it. Without contact from other continents, there is no pressure to consolidate into rigid states to compete externally. Power remains distributed. When larger confederations form, they do so to manage shared challenges, such as coordinating resource use across vast areas or responding to environmental shifts. These confederations are pragmatic rather than ideological. They exist as long as they serve a purpose and dissolve when they no longer do. Art and expression reflect this mobility. Portable art forms flourish. Storytelling, music, body ornamentation, and crafted objects designed to travel become central. Visual symbols emphasize motion, transformation, and relationship rather than permanence. Styles spread along routes, changing subtly as they move, adapting to local materials and aesthetics. No single artistic canon dominates because there is no single center from which it could radiate. Language, too, reflects movement. Dialects blend along travel corridors. Multilingualism is common not as a scholarly pursuit, but as a practical skill. People learn to communicate across groups because interaction is frequent and necessary. This produces languages that are flexible, borrowing terms and structures without concern for purity. Meaning is negotiated rather than fixed. Education happens on the move. Skills are taught through participation rather than formal instruction. Young people learn by traveling with experienced members, observing decisions, and gradually taking on responsibility. Knowledge is contextual. You learn what you need when you need it in the environment where it applies. This produces competence that is situational rather than abstract. As the climate shifts over long time scales, these societies adapt without collapsing. Ice ages, warming periods, and ecological transitions pose challenges. But the cultural emphasis on movement provides resilience. Routes change, patterns adjust. Some practices are abandoned, others revived. Memory of past adaptations guides future responses. What emerges is a civilization that does not define success by expansion or accumulation, but by continuity of movement. To endure is to remain capable of relocating, reconfiguring, and rebalancing. Stillness is sometimes necessary, sometimes valuable, but it is never assumed to be permanent. This orientation shapes how North American societies understand freedom. Freedom is not primarily the absence of constraint. It is the ability to move when needed, to follow opportunity, to leave when conditions worsen, to return when they improve. This requires social trust, shared knowledge, and mutual obligation. Movement is not solitary wandering. It is coordinated activity. Over time, this produces a strong ethic of hospitality. Travelers are not anomalies. They are expected. Systems develop to accommodate them to exchange news, goods, and assistance. Refusing hospitality is dangerous in a world where everyone may one day be passing through someone else's territory. Reciprocity is not sentimental. It is practical. North America's story unfolds along paths rather than walls. It does not aim toward a final form. It maintains readiness, always watching weather, listening to the land, adjusting routes, and carrying forward a way of life built not on holding ground at all costs, but on knowing when and how to move. Long before any society on this continent begins to think of itself as settled, the land teaches a particular lesson through contrast. Here, extremes sit side by side. Towering mountain chains rise sharply from lowlands. Dense forests press up against open plains. Rivers swell into vast arteries, while deserts remain almost motionless nearby. Nothing dominates everything else for long. Survival in this environment does not come from pushing one condition to its limit, but from learning how to live between them. In this isolated world, South America develops a civilization shaped less by expansion or accumulation, and more by calibration. The central challenge is not how to grow endlessly, but how to remain stable within a landscape that constantly shifts its demands. Floods arrive. Mountains restrict movement. Soil can be rich in one place and fragile in another. Climate changes dramatically with altitude. Even over short distances, every choice carries consequences that ripple outward quickly. And so the habit that forms early is careful adjustment rather than forceful control. People here learn to read gradients. Elevation matters. Rainfall matters. Season matters. Time matters. Decisions are rarely absolute. Instead, they are conditional. A valley is farmed only when water levels allow. A highland settlement expands only as far as terraces can be maintained without erosion. Forest resources are harvested selectively because regrowth is part of the equation, not an afterthought. The land makes it clear again and again that imbalance brings swift correction because no intercontinental contact ever arrives to offer alternative models or imported solutions. This sensitivity to balance deepens across generations. Knowledge accumulates around limits. People know not only what can be done, but how far it can be done safely. Excess is not admired. It is viewed with caution. A harvest that takes too much threatens the next season. A building that ignores terrain risks collapse. A leader who pushes too hard risks fracturing the delicate systems that sustain everyone. Agriculture, when it develops here, becomes a precise art. Terracing transforms steep slopes into productive land, but only when carefully engineered and constantly maintained. Irrigation channels are built to distribute water evenly, not maximally. Crop diversity becomes essential. Relying on a single staple invites disaster when weather shifts or disease strikes. Instead, fields are planted with complementary species that support one another, reducing risk through variety rather than scale. This approach extends beyond farming into social organization. Communities are structured to distribute responsibility rather than concentrate it. Leadership exists, but it is constrained by expectation. A leader's role is to preserve equilibrium between people and land, between different regions, between present needs and future survival. Authority that disrupts balance loses legitimacy quickly, not through ideology, but through visible consequence. Movement plays a role here, but it is measured. Unlike societies built around constant mobility, South American groups move vertically as much as horizontally. Seasonal shifts take people up and down mountain slopes, following temperature and moisture rather than distance alone. Trade routes thread through passes and along rivers, connecting ecological zones rather than flattening them into a single system. Exchange is based on complementarity. What one region lacks, another provides, not through conquest, but through negotiated interdependence. Because the continent contains such ecological diversity, no single way of life dominates. Highland societies develop differently from land-forest communities. Coastal groups align their rhythms with tides and currents. Desert-edge settlements refine conservation strategies that would be unnecessary elsewhere. All of these ways of living coexist, linked by trade, ritual, and shared understanding that none can thrive alone indefinitely. Belief systems reflect this awareness. Rather than emphasizing singular truths or absolute rules, spirituality often centers on reciprocity. Offerings are made not to appease distant forces, but to acknowledge ongoing relationships between humans, land, water, and sky. The idea that taking requires giving is embedded in daily practice. Rituals mark planting and harvest, migration and return not as symbolic gestures alone, but as reminders of dependence. Time in this context is not simply linear or cyclical. It is layered. Past actions remain present in the land. A poorly maintained terrace erodes years later. An overused field recovers slowly. Memory is environmental as much as cultural. People learn to see the landscape as a record of prior choices, visible and instructive. This reinforces caution and long-term thinking. Art and expression emerge from this relationship. Patterns often mirror natural forms. Designs repeat with variation, reflecting the idea that harmony does not require uniformity. Music and dance incorporate rhythm changes that echo seasonal shifts. Storytelling emphasizes consequences over heroics. A clever character succeeds not by overpowering others, but by navigating constraints intelligently. Writing, when it develops, is used selectively. Records focus on cycles, inventories, and obligations, rather than grand narratives of conquest. Knowledge is preserved not to glorify the past, but to guide future decisions. Genealogies matter, but so do records of land use, water rights, and mutual agreements. History is practical. Conflict does occur, as it does everywhere, but its scale is often limited by geography. Mountain barriers restrict large-scale warfare. Dense forests complicate sustained campaigns. More importantly, the interconnected nature of resources discourages prolonged disruption. A group that damages shared systems harms itself as well as its rivals. This does not eliminate violence, but it encourages mechanisms for resolution that restore balance rather than seek annihilation. These mechanisms can be formal or informal. Councils mediate disputes. Compensation replaces retaliation where possible. Ritualized competition channels tension into controlled forms. Even when conflicts escalate, there's often an effort to reintegrate rather than permanently exclude. Survival depends on maintaining functional relationships across regions and ecological zones. Education emphasizes observation and patience. Children learn by watching how elders interact with the land. Skills are taught through gradual participation. Mastery is measured by consistency rather than speed. Knowing when not to act is valued as much as knowing what to do. This produces individuals attuned to subtle cues, able to adjust behavior in response to changing conditions. As populations grow, urban centers do emerge, but they are constrained by geography. Cities develop in locations that allow access to multiple ecological zones. Their growth is regulated by the capacity of surrounding systems. When limits are reached, expansion slows or redirects rather than overwhelming the environment. Urban planning incorporates drainage, elevation, and resource flow as core considerations rather than secondary ones. This does not mean innovation stalls. Engineering becomes sophisticated. Architecture adapts to seismic activity. Road systems navigate extreme terrain, but innovation is guided by compatibility rather than domination. Solutions are evaluated not only for immediate benefit, but for long-term impact across interconnected systems. Without contact from other continents, there is no external pressure to extract maximum output or demonstrate technological supremacy. Progress is defined internally. Success is measured by stability, resilience, and continuity. A society that persists through environmental shifts without collapse is admired more than one that grows rapidly and fails. This orientation influences how South American civilizations understand risk. Risk is not avoided, but it is distributed. Redundancy is built into systems, multiple food sources, multiple trade partners, multiple pathways. Failure in one area does not cascade uncontrollably. This makes the civilization robust, even if it appears cautious from the outside. Identity forms around place, but not in an exclusive way. People identify with valleys, river basins, mountain ranges, and trade networks rather than rigid borders. Belonging is relational. You are part of a system because you participate in its balance. Exclusion is possible, but it is seen as destabilizing unless absolutely necessary. Over centuries, this produces a cultural confidence rooted in endurance. South American societies do not see themselves as fragile even though they acknowledge vulnerability. They trust their ability to adapt because adaptation has always been required. Balance is not static. It is active maintenance. As climates shift over long periods, these civilizations adjust. Crops move up slope or down slope. Trade routes are routed. Settlements relocate gradually. Memory of past adjustments guides present decisions. The land is not fought against. It is negotiated with continuously. This approach shapes how these societies view the unknown. Rather than fearing change outright, they approach it with assessment. What shifts? What remains? What compensations are required? This mindset reduces panic and encourages collective problem solving. South America's civilization remains centered on the space between extremes. It does not rush toward unification or fragmentation. It maintains equilibrium across difference. This does not lead to stasis. It leads to sustained complexity. Across this continent, time does not announce itself as something that moves forward in a straight line. It settles instead quietly and persistently into the land, into memory, into practice. Australia, in this imagined world of permanent separation, becomes a place where civilization does not measure itself by how far it has traveled from its beginnings, but by how faithfully it remembers them. The land here is ancient beyond ordinary human scale, and living upon it shapes a way of thinking that treats endurance as a form of knowledge rather than mere survival. From the earliest human presence, it becomes clear that Australia does not reward excess. Rainfall is unpredictable. Rivers can vanish and reappear. Soil varies sharply over short distances. Some regions remain stable for long periods, while others change abruptly. In such conditions, forcing the land into rigid systems carries consequences that linger. What develops instead is a civilization built on observation, restraint, and memory that reaches far deeper than written record ever could. Because no intercontinental contact arrives to disrupt or overwrite this relationship. Continuity becomes the defining feature of life here. People do not experience themselves as separate from their ancestors in any sharp sense. The past is not something that happened long ago and ended. It is present in paths still walked, in stories still told, in sites still visited because they hold meaning that does not fade with time. Knowledge is not accumulated for novelty. It is preserved for accuracy. Movement exists, but it is guided by remembered patterns rather than constant exploration. Routes follow water availability, seasonal changes, and long-established pathways that link places of importance. These paths are not chosen arbitrarily. They encode generations of experience. To deviate from them without understanding is dangerous. To follow them is to move through a landscape already mapped by memory rather than measurement. In this context, storytelling is not entertainment or myth in the modern sense. It is infrastructure. Stories encode geography, resource management, social obligation, and moral boundaries all at once. A narrative about an ancestral figure traveling across the land is also a map. It describes where water can be found, which areas should be avoided at certain times, and how different regions are connected. These stories are precise. Errors are corrected over time because accuracy matters. Because the land itself changes slowly, but decisively, time here is understood as layered rather than fleeting. Short-term variation exists, but it sits atop patterns that repeat over immense spans. Fire regimes, for example, are not disasters to be eliminated. They are processes to be guided. Controlled burning becomes a way of maintaining balance, encouraging new growth, and preventing larger destructive fires. This practice requires long memory. Burn too often and the land degrades. Burn too rarely and fuel accumulates dangerously. Social organization reflects this deep temporal awareness. Authority is not concentrated around innovation or expansion. It centers on custodianship. Those who hold knowledge of land, seasons, and stories carry responsibility rather than dominance. Leadership is earned through understanding and maintained through trust. Decisions are evaluated not by immediate outcome alone, but by alignment with inherited knowledge that has already proven itself over countless cycles. Because Australia remains isolated from other continents, there is no external pressure to redefine success. Societies here do not compare themselves to others or measure progress through accumulation. Instead, they evaluate continuity. Has the land remained productive? Have relationships held? Have stories remained accurate? Stability is not seen as stagnation. It is seen as confirmation that systems remain in harmony with conditions that cannot be rushed or conquered. Language develops accordingly. Words often carry layered meaning tied to place, action, and memory simultaneously. Names for locations are not arbitrary labels. They describe events, features, or responsibilities associated with that place. To speak a name is to reference history. Language becomes a tool for remembering rather than abstracting. Communication reinforces connection to land rather than detachment from it. Timekeeping does not revolve around fixed calendars. Instead, it follows environmental cues. The flowering of certain plants signals seasonal change. The behavior of animals indicates shifts in resource availability. People attune themselves to these signs through observation rather than calculation. Time is experienced as readiness. When certain conditions appear, certain actions follow. This reduces reliance on prediction and increases responsiveness. Trade exists, but it moves along established corridors that respect territorial knowledge. Exchange is not primarily about maximizing volume. It is about maintaining relationships. Goods carry stories of where they came from and how they should be used. Knowledge travels alongside materials, reinforcing shared understanding across regions. Movement strengthens memory rather than replacing it. Conflict arises as it does everywhere, but it is constrained by the recognition that long-term coexistence is unavoidable. The land cannot support endless displacement or destruction. Disputes are often resolved through negotiation, ritual, or rebalancing of obligations. Violence, when it occurs, is understood as failure rather than strategy. Repair becomes as important as assertion. Art reflects this worldview. Expression is tied to place and continuity. Designs are renewed rather than reinvented. A pattern painted on rock echoes, one traced in sand or sung in rhythm. The act of repetition is not seen as copying. It is seen as renewal. Each performance reinforces connection to ancestral knowledge, while allowing subtle adaptation to present conditions. Because the continent's ecosystems are fragile in places and resilient in others, knowledge remains localized. No single group claims universal understanding. Instead, networks of expertise form. People consult, though, with knowledge of specific regions or conditions. This distributed understanding prevents overconfidence and encourages humility. No one assumes mastery over the entire land. As populations grow slowly, they remain dispersed. Large permanent urban centers offer little advantage when resources fluctuate and mobility remains essential. Instead, social density increases during gatherings and disperses afterward. These gatherings serve multiple functions. They reinforce kinship, exchange information, arrange partnerships, and recalibrate shared understanding. Afterward, groups return to their respective regions, carrying updated knowledge with them. Education happens through participation rather than instruction alone. Children learn by accompanying elders, observing decisions, and gradually assuming responsibility. Mistakes are corrected gently because the goal is not speed, but accuracy. Forgetting a detail can have serious consequences. Remembering correctly is a form of care. Technology develops cautiously. Tools are refined incrementally. New techniques are adopted only after long evaluation. This does not prevent innovation, but it filters it. A tool that damages land or disrupts balance is abandoned. One that improves efficiency without cost is retained. Progress is judged by compatibility rather than novelty. Because there is no external civilization to introduce disruptive technologies, suddenly change occurs gradually. This allows societies to integrate innovation without collapse. Systems evolve without breaking continuity. Memory absorbs new elements rather than resisting them outright. Over thousands of years, this produces a civilization that experiences time differently from others. Time is not scarce. It is abundant. The urgency to expand, conquer, or accumulate never fully takes hold because the land itself discourages it. Patience becomes practical. Waiting is often wiser than acting. This does not mean life is easy. Scarcity exists. Hardship occurs. Loss is part of experience. But hardship is interpreted through long memory. A drought is severe, but it has happened before. Recovery follows patterns remembered and passed on. This perspective reduces panic and fosters collective resilience. Identity here is inseparable from place. To know who you are is to know where you belong, not in terms of ownership, but responsibility. The land is not a resource to be consumed. It is a record to be maintained. People see themselves as temporary participants in a story that began long before them and will continue after they are gone. As climates shift over geological timescales, societies adjust gradually, routes change, practices adapt. Stories are updated to reflect new conditions while preserving core knowledge. Memory remains dynamic rather than frozen. Australia's civilization develops around fidelity to what has already been learned. This does not prevent complexity. It creates a different kind of sophistication, one rooted in attentiveness and restraint. Australia's story continues quietly, grounded in remembrance rather than ambition, maintaining continuity across deep time while remaining open to subtle change, prepared to carry its accumulated knowledge forward into whatever conditions may come next. Nothing about this continent ever invited permanence. Even before humans imagined themselves as builders of civilizations, Antarctica stood apart as a place that resisted attachment, memory, and continuity in the familiar sense. In this world of separated continents, where each land mass develops its own human story in isolation, Antarctica remains the outlier. not because it lacks significance, but because significance here takes a different form. This is not the story of a civilization that rose and fell. It is the story of one that never formed. And why that absence matters. From the outset, Antarctica presents conditions that do not gradually shape society, but actively prevent it from stabilizing. Temperatures remain hostile to sustained habitation. Ice dominates not just the surface, but the rhythm of existence itself. The land beneath is largely inaccessible, locked away under kiln of frozen mass. Seasons are extreme to the point of distortion. Months of darkness follow months of unbroken daylight. For human beings whose social structures depend on predictability, repetition, and shared cycles, this environment offers little to anchor to. In earlier geological eras, Antarctica was not always so forbidding. It once supported forests, rivers, and diverse life. But by the time humans exist as a species capable of forming civilization, those conditions are long gone. The continent has already committed to ice. In this imagined history, with no global exploration or intercontinental migration, Antarctica is never approached as a frontier to conquer or study. It exists at the edge of awareness, known vaguely through distant observation, but never integrated into human life. Unlike other continents, Antarctica does not invite gradual adaptation. There is no sequence of small adjustments that lead from survival to settlement. The threshold between possible and impossible is sharp. Temporary presence may occur at the margins during rare favorable periods, but these incursions leave no lasting trace. The environment erases evidence quickly. Structures fail. Paths vanish. Memory cannot attach itself to place, because place does not hold still long enough to be remembered. In societies elsewhere, civilization emerges through repetition. People return to the same riverbank. They rebuild in the same valley. They mark the same seasons. Over time, these repetitions create familiarity, and familiarity allows complexity to grow. Antarctica disrupts this process entirely. Repetition is unreliable. A location accessible one year may be unreachable the next. Ice shifts. Storms rearrange the surface. There is no stable reference point from which a culture could root itself. Time behaves differently here. On other continents, even harsh ones, time is something people negotiate with. In Antarctica, time overwhelms. The scale of cold compresses human perception. Survival consumes attention so completely, the reflection becomes secondary. Without the capacity to pause, accumulate, and transmit knowledge across generations, civilization cannot take hold. There is no surplus of energy, food, or attention to invest in long-term structures. The absence of a civilization does not mean absence of meaning. Antarctica shapes human imagination precisely because it resists human presence. It becomes a negative space in the collective understanding of the world, a place that exists but not for us. In a world without global contact, this idea remains localized. Coastal societies in the southern reaches may know of a vast frozen land beyond the horizon, but it occupies the realm of cautionary tale rather than destination. Stories about Antarctica, where they exist, are not about opportunity or promise. They are about limits. They warn of cold that does not forgive error, of light that disappears for months, of silence so complete it unsettles the mind. These stories serve a function. They reinforce the boundaries of the habitable world. They remind people that not every place is meant to be settled, shaped, or understood fully. Because Antarctica never hosts sustained human life, it never develops the layered memory that characterizes civilization. There are no ancestral roots, no sacred sites maintained through ritual, no structures passed down. Instead, the land remains indifferent. Ice flows over rock without recording names. Snow buries whatever briefly interrupts it. The continent does not accumulate human history. It sheds it. This has subtle consequences for how other civilizations understand themselves. The existence of a place where civilization cannot form introduces the concept of absolute constraint. Elsewhere, hardship can usually be mitigated with enough ingenuity, cooperation, or patience. Antarctica challenges this assumption. It demonstrates that some environments do not respond to adaptation in meaningful ways. This realization shapes philosophy indirectly. It tempers beliefs in limitless human capability. In practical terms, Antarctica also lacks the ecological foundation necessary for civilization. There are no stable food webs to humans without extreme specialization. Large terrestrial animals are absent. Plant life is minimal and seasonal. Marine resources exist, but exploiting them requires technology and coordination far beyond what isolated coastal societies would develop without external stimulus. Even then, extraction would be precarious and temporary. Without agriculture, there is no reason for permanent settlement. Without settlement, there is no accumulation of infrastructure. Without infrastructure, there is no mechanism for transmitting complex knowledge reliably across generations. The chain breaks at the first link. Civilization does not fail here. It never begins. The climate also imposes psychological strain. Extended darkness disrupts circadian rhythms. Isolation intensifies stress. Constant exposure to lethal cold leaves little room for error. In small, transient groups, these pressures might be endured briefly. Over generations, they erode cohesion. The environment selects against long-term habitation, not through catastrophe, but through attrition. As other continents develop rich internal diversity, Antarctica remains singular in its refusal to participate. It does not fragment into regions with different adaptations. It does not offer niches that encourage varied ways of life. Its uniformity is part of its resistance. Ice dominates nearly everything. Variation exists, but it is not the kind that supports social differentiation or specialization. The absence of a civilization also means absence of transformation. Antarctica remains largely unchanged by human activity. There are no fields cleared, no forests cut, no rivers redirected. This contrasts sharply with other continents, where human presence reshapes landscapes over time. Antarctica becomes the one place where the planet's processes continue without human mediation. In this way, Antarctica functions as a control case in the story of civilization. It shows what happens when human adaptability reaches its limit. It highlights how much of civilization depends not just on intelligence or cooperation, but on environments that allow for error, recovery, and gradual improvement. Antarctica offers none of these buffers. The concept of ownership never arises here. There is nothing to own in a meaningful sense. No land can be claimed because no land can be reliably used. This absence influences how distant societies conceptualize territory. The idea that land must always be claimed or settled is quietly undermined by the existence of a place where neither is possible. Over long stretches of time, Antarctica becomes less a physical place in human thought and more a boundary condition. It marks the edge of the world, not geographically but existentially. It is where human stories stop, not because curiosity ends, but because continuation is unsustainable. This does not mean Antarctica is ignored entirely. It appears in cosmologies as a realm of testing, of purification, or of absence. Some cultures may imagine it as a place where the world empties itself of excess. Others may see it as a reminder of the planet's indifference. Interpretations vary, but all agree on one thing. It is not a place to remain. In the absence of writing, monuments, or persistent occupation, Antarctica leaves no human timeline. There are no eras to name, no golden ages, no declines. Its history from a human perspective is flat. The same conditions repeat with minor variation. Ice advances, ice retreats slightly, ice returns. The cycle is long, slow, and unconcerned. This continuity without civilization introduces a counterpoint to the rest of the world. While other continents wrestle with memory, reinvention, balance, or movement, Antarctica stands outside those struggles. It does not adapt to humans. Humans must adapt completely or withdraw. In this imagined history, withdrawal always wins. As millennia pass, Antarctica remains unchanged while civilizations elsewhere rise in complexity. This asymmetry influences how humanity understands its place on the planet. The world is not entirely malleable. Some parts remain beyond integration. This understanding tempers ambition and reframes success. The absence of an Antarctic civilization also affects future possibilities. When other continents eventually reach technological levels that might allow temporary exploration, Antarctica still resists permanence. Any presence remains fleeting. The land refuses incorporation into daily human life. It remains a margin, not a center. In this way, Antarctica's role is paradoxical. By hosting no civilization, it becomes essential to the story of civilization itself. It defines the boundary of what is possible. It reminds humanity that not all spaces are meant to be filled, organized, or remembered through human structures. At some point, without ceremony and without anyone deciding outright, water becomes more than geography. It becomes separation. Not immediately and not in any dramatic moment, but gradually, as coastlines define the edge of familiarity, and the horizon becomes a place where knowledge thins out instead of expanding. In a world where continents remain isolated from one another, oceans are not highways waiting to be crossed. They are conclusions. They mark where experience stops and speculation begins. For people living on these continents, water shapes psychology long before it shapes technology. A mountain can be climbed. A forest can be entered. A desert can be crossed with preparation and luck. An ocean, however, offers no incremental progress. You cannot learn it step by step. In the same way, beyond a certain point, it stops rewarding curiosity and starts punishing it. This reality quietly trains human attention inward. Coastal societies still develop, of course. Rivers meet seas, fish are plentiful, weather patterns become familiar. Boats emerge for nearshore use, for following coastlines, for crossing bays and estuaries. But the logic of these vessels is local. They are designed to return. They are not invitations to disappear over the horizon. The sea is engaged with cautiously, respectfully, and always with an expectation of coming back to land that is already known. Over generations, this creates a psychological boundary that is stronger than any physical one. People know there is more water beyond what they can see, but they do not assume that it leads anywhere meaningful for them. The ocean does not promise opportunity. It represents uncertainty without clear reward and without evidence of other lands beyond it. There is little motivation to risk lives, resources, and accumulated knowledge on the possibility alone. This has profound effects on how societies imagine the world. Each continent becomes in practice the entire world, not symbolically, but functionally. Everything that matters is contained within reachable land. The idea of other human civilizations existing elsewhere never solidifies because there is no contact to reinforce it. Speculation may exist, but it remains abstract and unverifiable, closer to cosmology than geography. As a result, isolation does not feel like deprivation. It feels normal. People do not experience themselves as cut off from something they should have. They experience themselves as complete within the boundaries they know. This completeness reduces anxiety about comparison. There is no sense of falling behind or missing out. Progress, success, and failure are measured internally. The presence of water as an unreached boundary also shapes identity. Belonging becomes deeply tied to land, rather than affiliation with distant abstractions. You are from a river basin, a coast, a plateau, a forest. These identities are reinforced because movement beyond them is possible. But movement beyond the continent is not. The scale of belonging is large enough to contain diversity, but small enough to remain comprehensible. Language reflects this inward focus. Words develop to describe subtle differences within the known world. There is no need for terms describing foreign peoples across oceans, because such peoples remain hypothetical. Instead, vocabularies expand around weather, terrain, seasonal variation, and social nuance. Precision develops where experience exists, not where imagination wanders. Isolation also alters how danger is perceived. Threats come from within the continent rather than beyond it. Environmental shifts, resource scarcity, and neighboring groups occupy attention. There is no fear of invasion from unknown lands. No anticipation of sudden arrival by people with unfamiliar technologies or beliefs. This reduces certain kinds of paranoia, while intensifying focus on internal balance. Over time, this inward orientation shapes moral systems. Ethics are framed around maintaining harmony within a closed world. Actions are evaluated by their impact on shared land and shared future, rather than competition with outsiders. Responsibility feels heavier because there is nowhere else to go. Damage cannot be outsourced. Consequences remain local. Water reinforces this mindset. Daily waves erase footprints. Tides repeat without regard for human schedules. Storms remind coastal populations that the sea is powerful but indifferent. This fosters humility rather than conquest. Even when maritime skills improve, they're applied conservatively. Fishing extends range slightly. Trade follows coasts. Exploration stops short of committing to open ocean. Psychologically, this builds a strong sense of boundary awareness. People know where their knowledge ends. The horizon is accepted as a limit rather than a challenge. This does not eliminate curiosity, but it redirects it. Curiosity turns toward refining understanding of what is already accessible. Deeper knowledge replaces broader reach. Isolation also affects how societies respond to internal diversity. Because there is no external other to define identity against, difference within the continent becomes more visible. Cultural variation is acknowledged rather than flattened. Multiple ways of living coexist without needing to unify under a global narrative. This can produce tension, but it also encourages negotiation and coexistence. At the same time, isolation magnifies memory. With no influx of outside ideas to disrupt continuity, suddenly change happens gradually. Traditions persist longer. Innovation spreads slowly. This allows society to observe consequences over extended periods. Mistakes are remembered because their effects remain within the same system. The ocean's role as a psychological barrier also influences ambition. Ambition is not eliminated, but it is reframed. Success is not imagined as reaching beyond the world. It is imagined as mastering complexity within it. Large projects focus on land management, social organization, and internal connectivity rather than expansion outward. This inward ambition produces impressive achievements. Road systems span continents. Trade networks link distant regions. Knowledge circulates extensively within boundaries, but the scale remains comprehensible. The world feels knowable, even if not fully known. This contrasts sharply with a world where horizons constantly expand. Isolation also affects how societies imagine the future. The future is not a place of radical surprise arriving from elsewhere. It is an extension of current conditions shaped by choices made now. This fosters long-term thinking. Planning assumes continuity rather than disruption by external forces. The absence of external comparison also reduces the drive for standardization. There is no global benchmark to meet. Systems evolve to fit local needs rather than universal criteria. Diversity persists because there is no pressure to conform to an external norm. Emotionally, isolation can produce both security and vulnerability. Security comes from familiarity. Vulnerability comes from knowing that solutions must come from within. There is no rescue from outside. This encourages mutual reliance. Cooperation is not idealized. It is necessary. Over generations, people internalize the idea that the world is finite, not in size, but in accessibility. This finitude shapes values. Conservation becomes intuitive. Waste feels dangerous. Overreach feels reckless. The idea of endless growth never fully takes root because physical boundaries are visible and respected. Water reinforces these lessons constantly. Coastlines are reminders of limits. Islands near shore become symbols of how far one can go and still return. Beyond them lies uncertainty that offers little incentive. As societies mature, some individuals inevitably question these limits. They wonder what lies beyond. They imagine other lands. But without reinforcement, these questions remain speculative. They do not reorganize society. Curiosity exists without becoming directive. The psychology of isolation thus becomes self-reinforcing. Because people do not expect contact. They do not prepare for it. Because they do not prepare for it, contact remains unlikely. The ocean stays a boundary rather than a bridge. This does not make civilizations inward-looking in a narrow sense. Within continents, exchange is rich, ideas travel, cultures interact, complexity flourishes. Isolation operates at the scale of the planet, not the scale of daily life. As time passes, each continent develops a complete internal world. The absence of intercontinental contact does not stunt civilization. It shapes it. Water by remaining uncrossed teaches humanity something subtle but profound. That not every boundary needs to be breached for life to be meaningful, complex, or full. Strip away the idea of being overheard, and language begins to behave differently. When no one beyond your own continent is listening, when there is no expectation that words will ever need to travel farther than familiar land and familiar minds, speech stops trying to be portable. It stops trying to be exportable. Instead, it settles into place, shaped by environment, shared experience, and long memory rather than comparison or translation. In this world of permanently separated continents, language does not evolve under the pressure of contact. There are no foreign tongues to compete with, no need for trade pigeons, no borrowed alphabets drifting in from elsewhere. Every linguistic change happens internally, responding to local needs and habits. Over time, this creates languages that are extraordinarily precise, where they need to be, and unconcerned with clarity beyond that scope. The first change appears in vocabulary. Words proliferate around what matters most. Landscapes carve meaning into speech. In places where water availability determines survival, language grows dense with terms describing moisture, soil condition, seasonal flow, and subtle variations in rainfall. In regions shaped by movement, there are many ways to describe direction, pace, and transition. In areas governed by continuity, words accumulate around ancestry, sequence, and obligation. There is no incentive to keep language lean for outsiders. Redundancy is not inefficiency. It is insurance against misunderstanding within the group because there is no external audience. Metaphor behaves differently too. Metaphors do not need to bridge unfamiliar concepts. They assume shared reference. A phrase can rely on an obscure local feature because everyone listening knows it. Over generations, this creates layers of meaning that are inseparable from place. A sentence spoken in one valley might be grammatically correct elsewhere on the continent, but emotionally flat because the reference points do not resonate in the same way. Pronunciation follows similar paths. Sounds adapt to environment and social use rather than standardization. In open landscapes, longer vowels and projected consonants carry well. In dense forests, Clipped sounds and softer tones reduce echo and confusion. Over time, these patterns become embedded. No academy arises to regulate them. There is no perceived benefit in enforcing uniformity across regions that rarely need to sound alike. Grammar, too, reflects lived reality. Some languages develop structures that emphasize process rather than outcome. Others encode obligation directly into verbs. Some treat time as something layered, others as something conditional. Without exposure to alternative grammatical systems, speakers do not perceive these structures as choices. They are simply how thought unfolds. The idea that language could be otherwise never arises strongly enough to matter. Isolation also alters how new words enter the language. Innovation is slow and contextual. A new tool receives a name based on function or origin, rather than borrowed prestige. If the tool becomes obsolete, the word fades with it. There is no accumulation of archaic terms kept alive through external influence. Language sheds what is no longer useful because nothing reinforces it artificially. Writing, when it develops, mirrors this inward focus. Scripts evolve to suit local materials and cognitive habits rather than aesthetic trends from elsewhere. Some writing systems prioritize speed. Others prioritize permanence. Some favor symbolic density. Others remain phonetic. Without external pressure to standardize, multiple systems can coexist within the same continent, each optimized for its purpose. Importantly, writing does not freeze language in this world. It records it selectively. Spoken language continues to change and written forms adapt gradually, rather than resisting. There is no sense that written language represents a higher or more correct version. It is simply another tool. Oral tradition remains authoritative where it functions better because no one else is listening. Politeness shifts too. Speech does not need to perform identity for outsiders. Social signaling becomes subtle. Tone, timing, and shared silence carry as much meaning as words. What is left unsaid is often more informative than what is spoken. This deepens interpersonal awareness and reinforces communal norms. Language also becomes more forgiving of ambiguity. When shared context is strong, precision can relax. A phrase can mean slightly different things in different situations without causing confusion. Listeners infer meaning from relationship and circumstance. This reduces the need for rigid definitions. Words remain flexible, shaped by use rather than fixed by rule. Humor reflects this intimacy. Jokes rely heavily on shared memory, local history, and subtle shifts in phrasing. Humor does not travel well even within the continent, and that is acceptable. Laughter is for those who are present. There is no expectation that humor should be universally accessible. The absence of an external audience also affects how language handles power. Titles exist, but they are grounded in function rather than display. Grandiose language offers little advantage when everyone understands the practical limits of authority. Speech that exaggerates status is often met with quiet skepticism rather than admiration. Credibility comes from alignment between words and action. Over time, this produces languages that are deeply economical within their context and nearly impenetrable outside it. Not because they are deliberately exclusionary, but because they never needed to be otherwise. Translation, if attempted hypothetically, would struggle not with vocabulary alone, but with worldview. Many concepts would lack equivalence because they arose to solve problems that do not exist elsewhere. This inward evolution also affects how children learn language. Acquisition is immersive rather than instructional. Children absorb speech patterns through participation, not correction. Mistakes are tolerated as part of learning. Precision comes later, shaped by experience rather than rule memorization. This produces speakers who are sensitive to nuance and context. Language change, when it occurs, spreads through networks of relationship rather than authority. A new expression gains traction because it is useful or resonant, not because it is promoted. Regional variation persists without being seen as error. Difference is normal. Uniformity is unnecessary. The absence of intercontinental contact also removes the incentive to create universal terms. Measurements remain local. Concepts are framed relationally rather than abstractly. Distance is described by effort, time by readiness, value by usefulness. This grounds language and experience rather than representation. Silence gains importance in this environment. When language is not used to broadcast identity outward, silence becomes communicative. Pauses indicate respect, hesitation, or agreement. Speaking too much can be seen as disruptive. This shapes conversational rhythm. Exchanges slow down. Listening becomes active. As centuries pass, languages deepen rather than widen. They accumulate internal reference rather than external borrowing. This creates a strong bond between language and identity. Losing language would mean losing access to accumulated knowledge embedded within it. As a result, linguistic preservation is not ideological. It is practical. When dialects diverge, they do so gradually. Mutual intelligibility fades slowly, often asymmetrically. But because there is no external pressure to unify, divergence is accepted. People adjust when needed. Multilingualism within continents becomes common, driven by interaction rather than policy. This linguistic landscape also influences thought. Without exposure to radically different linguistic frameworks, people do not regularly question how language shapes perception. Reflection exists, but it is internal. Philosophical inquiry focuses on meaning within the system, rather than comparison between systems. Language is seen as natural rather than constructed. Over long periods, this produces civilizations with profound internal coherence. Communication works smoothly where it matters. Misunderstanding still occurs, but it is addressed through shared reference rather than clarification for outsiders. Language remains a living system, responsive to need. The idea of being overheard never quite takes hold. Speech is assumed to remain within the circle of those who understand it. This assumption reduces performative speech. Words are chosen for function rather than impression. Eloquence is valued, but only insofar as it serves clarity or connection. Remove the mirror and invention slows down in a very particular way. When technology no longer develops under the pressure of comparison, when there is no rival to outpace and no distant society to measure against, progress does not stop, but it changes character. In this world of isolated continents, technology grows inward, shaped not by competition, but by adequacy. The question guiding innovation is not, can this be faster, larger, or more impressive, but does this work well enough here under these conditions for these people? Without intercontinental contact, there is no shared technological timeline, no sense that certain tools mark advancement or that others signal backwardness. Each continent develops its own technological rhythm, responding to environment, population density, and cultural priorities. A technology persists not because it represents progress in some abstract sense, but because abandoning it would create new problems without solving old ones. This begins early. Basic tools emerge everywhere, but their refinement diverges quickly. Stone tools, for example, do not disappear simply because metal becomes possible. In many places, stone remains preferable for certain tasks. It is abundant, predictable, and easily replaced. Metalwork develops where resources and energy allow. But it does not automatically dominate all aspects of life. Without competition, there is no incentive to replace functional systems wholesale because there is no external benchmark. Innovation is evaluated locally and slowly. A new technique spreads only if it proves itself over time. Failure is not hidden or excused by prestige. It is visible and instructive. This creates a conservative filter that slows adoption but increases reliability. Technologies are stress-tested not through rapid iteration, but through long-term use across variable conditions. Energy use reflects this restraint. Large-scale exploitation of resources does not accelerate unchecked because there is no race demanding exponential growth. Extraction occurs, but it is balanced against regeneration and labor cost. A technology that saves time but destroys land is viewed skeptically. Time saved today can be outweighed by hardship tomorrow. This calculus becomes ingrained. Infrastructure develops accordingly. Roads are built where movement is essential, not everywhere it is possible. Water systems are constructed to stabilize existing settlements rather than enable uncontrolled expansion. Buildings are designed to last and be repaired rather than replaced frequently. Standardization occurs only where it simplifies maintenance, not where it serves abstract efficiency. Without competition, redundancy is not seen as wasteful. Multiple methods exist for performing the same task, and this diversity is preserved. If one method fails under certain conditions, another remains. This increases resilience. This uniform solutions are avoided because they create single points of failure. Variety becomes a strength. Technology also develops more slowly in symbolic terms. There is less fascination with novelty for its own sake. New devices are introduced quietly, integrated into daily life without fanfare. There are no technological revolutions in the modern sense, only gradual shifts in practice. This reduces disruption. Social structures have time to adjust alongside tools rather than being overwhelmed by them. Knowledge transmission reflects this pace. Technical skills are taught through apprenticeship and observation rather than formalized abstraction alone. Understanding how and why a tool works is valued as much as knowing how to use it. This prevents over-reliance on systems that few understand. Expertise is distributed rather than concentrated because continents remain isolated. There is no global diffusion of ideas that accelerates technological convergence. Parallel inventions occur, but they are not synchronized. One continent may develop advanced water management, while another refines navigation, and neither feels pressure to adopt the other's focus. This produces technological specialization aligned with environment rather than universal standards. Measurement systems remain local. Precision exists where needed, but units are grounded in practical reference rather than universal abstraction. Length may be measured by reach, distance by travel time, weight by effort. This limits certain forms of theoretical development, but enhances usability. Tools are designed for human scale rather than optimization for machines. Communication technology develops differently as well. Without distant audiences, there is little motivation to amplify signals beyond regional needs. Messaging systems prioritize reliability over speed. Long-distance communication within continents improves, but it remains bounded. There is no drive to compress time globally because there is no global coordination required. The absence of competition also affects innovation culture. Inventors are not celebrated as disruptive geniuses. They are valued as problem solvers embedded in their communities. Credit is shared. Improvements are collective. This reduces secrecy and intellectual hoarding. Knowledge circulates because it benefits everyone involved. At the same time, this environment discourages speculative technology. Tools are built to solve existing problems rather than anticipated ones. Futurism remains muted. Imagination focuses on refining present systems rather than leaping toward hypothetical futures. This reduces wasteful experimentation, but also slows radical breakthroughs. Resource management technologies reflect this balance. Mining occurs, but not at scales that devastate ecosystems quickly. Forestry integrates regrowth cycles. Agriculture incorporates crop rotation and diversity as default. Tools evolve to support these practices rather than override them. Mechanization appears where labor demands it, but it does not displace human involvement entirely. The relationship between technology and power is also altered. Control over advanced tools does not automatically translate into dominance because tools are integrated into shared systems. A leader who hoards technology undermines communal function and loses legitimacy. Power remains relational rather than purely technical. Urbanization follows similar patterns. Cities grow, but their technologies focus on sanitation, water distribution, and food supply rather than spectacle. Engineering prioritizes habitability. Monumental construction exists, but it is tied to ritual, memory, or coordination rather than assertion of superiority. Because technology does not advance through arms races, weapon development is slower and more constrained. Defense technologies emerge, but they do not escalate endlessly. The cost of excessive militarization outweighs perceived benefit when there is no external enemy with superior tools. Conflict remains localized, limiting technological amplification of violence. Failure plays a constructive role in this system. When a technology proves harmful or ineffective, it is abandoned without stigma. There is no narrative of progress requiring justification. Tools serve people, not the other way around. This flexibility prevents lock-in to flawed systems over long periods. This creates civilizations with deep technological wisdom rather than rapid advancement. They know what works for them and why. They are less impressed by complexity and more attentive to appropriateness. A simple tool used well is preferred to a complex one that demands constant maintenance. This does not mean stagnation. Change continues. Knowledge accumulates. Techniques improve, but the slope of progress is gentler. Plateaus are accepted. Not every problem demands a technological solution. Some are addressed socially or behaviorally instead, because there is no external comparison. Technologies are rarely framed as defining identity. A society does not think of itself as advanced or primitive. It thinks of itself as functional. This reduces shame and pride associated with tools. Technology becomes background rather than symbol. Environmental feedback plays a strong role in guiding innovation. When a technology disrupts balance, consequences are felt locally and promptly. This immediate feedback discourages unsustainable practices. Long-term thinking becomes practical rather than moral. As populations grow, some pressure toward efficiency emerges, but it is moderated by cultural memory. Past collapses, resource depletion, or social strain remain visible in stories and landscape. These memories inform technological choices. Short-term gain is weighed against known risks. Education in technical matters emphasizes adaptability. People learn not just how to build tools, but how to modify them when conditions change. This produces resilience. When a material becomes scarce, alternatives are sought. When climate shifts, designs adjust. Without competition, technology also becomes less centralized. No single authority dictates standards across continents. Within continents, coordination exists but variation persists. This decentralization reduces vulnerability to systemic failure. Innovation networks form around necessity rather than prestige. Those facing particular challenges develop solutions. These spread where relevant and stop where they are not. There is no drive to universalize. Over centuries, this creates a technological landscape that looks uneven from an outside perspective, but coherent internally. Some regions possess advanced engineering in specific domains, while lacking others entirely. This is not seen as imbalance. It is seen as specialization. The absence of competition also affects pace of obsolescence. Tools remain in use longer. Repair culture thrives. Objects are maintained rather than replaced. This reduces waste and reinforces skill retention. As continents continue evolving separately, Technology remains deeply contextual. It does not aspire to transcend environment. It works with it. Progress is measured by continuity of life rather than accumulation of capacity. This approach produces societies that are technologically capable without being technologically obsessed. Tools exist to support living, not redefine it. Innovation serves survival, comfort, and coordination, but rarely identity. Look closely enough at any belief system that has never had to explain itself to outsiders, and the first thing you notice is how little it tries to persuade. In a world where continents remain isolated and civilizations grow without contact, belief does not arise to compete, convert, or justify itself. It arises to orient people within the land they already inhabit. Meaning is not abstracted upward into universal claims. It spreads outward from soil, weather, animals, and the repeated experience of living in one place long enough to understand its patterns. When belief systems are born from landscape alone, they are not constructed as answers to philosophical questions in the modern sense. They are responses to pressure, uncertainty, abundance, and risk. They encode practical understanding long before they articulate metaphysical ideas. A belief does not need to be logically airtight. It needs to work. It needs to help people decide when to plan, when to move, when to cooperate, and when to wait. Because there is no intercontinental contact, no belief system ever needs to define itself against another one. There is no heresy in the sense of deviation from an external standard. Disagreement exists, but it remains internal, shaped by regional difference rather than ideological conflict. What develops instead are belief landscapes as varied as the physical ones they emerge from, each coherent within its own context. In environments defined by stability, belief systems tend to emphasize continuity. Where seasons are predictable and resources renew reliably, meaning gathers around maintenance rather than an intervention. The world is not perceived as something broken that must be fixed. It is something ordered that must be preserved. Rituals focus on repetition. The sacred is encountered in correct timing rather than dramatic transformation. Change is acknowledged, but it is framed as adjustment within an enduring structure. In contrast, landscapes marked by volatility produce beliefs oriented toward negotiation. Where floods, droughts, or seismic activity disrupt expectations, belief systems emphasize balance and reciprocity. Humans are not imagined as masters of the world, but as participants in ongoing exchanges. Actions are believed to provoke responses. Excess invites correction. Harmony is not automatic. It must be maintained through attention and restraint. Importantly, none of these beliefs are articulated as metaphors. They are not symbolic representations of abstract truths. They are lived explanations. When people say that a river is alive, they are not making a poetic claim. They're expressing an observation grounded in experience. The river behaves in ways that require respect. Treating it as inert leads to harm. Language reflects this practicality. Because belief systems are not exported or challenged by distant alternatives. They retain strong local specificity. Sacred sites correspond to real locations. Mountains, springs, forests, and valleys hold a meaning because of what happens there, not because of universal symbolism. A mountain is sacred because it shapes weather, restricts movement, or shelters water. A forest is revered because it feeds, hides, and sustains. Meaning does not float above place. It adheres to it. This attachment to landscape shapes cosmology. The structure of the universe is often imagined in terms that mirror the environment. Flat plains encourage horizontal cosmologies. Vertical landscapes encourage layered worlds. Dense forests produce belief centered on concealment and revelation. Open skies foster attention to celestial patterns. These are not arbitrary associations. They emerge from repeated sensory experience over generations because continents remain isolated. Belief systems do not consolidate into single dominant frameworks across entire land masses. Variation persists. Neighboring regions develop related but distinct interpretations. Shared stories diverge gradually. Differences are tolerated because they do not threaten a global order. Diversity does not require resolution. Time plays a crucial role in these belief systems. Without external historical narratives, time is experienced locally. Origin story do not attempt to explain the creation of the entire universe. They explain the beginning of this land, this people, this relationship. Endings are not absolute either. Belief rarely centers on final judgment or ultimate conclusions. Instead, it emphasizes cycles, renewal, and continuity. This temporal orientation influences moral systems. Morality is not enforced by distant consequences in an afterlife alone. It is reinforced by immediate impact on community and land. Actions that disrupt balance produce visible harm. Actions that sustain relationships produce stability. Ethics are grounded in cause and effect rather than decree. Because belief systems are not competing for dominance, they are less concerned with exclusivity. There is little emphasis on belief as identity marker separating insiders from outsiders. Belief is something you participate in, not something you declare allegiance to. Practice matters more than doctrine. Correct behavior outweighs correct belief. Ritual emerges as a central mechanism for maintaining alignment. Rituals are not performances for an audience. They are coordinated actions that reinforce shared understanding. They mark transitions, resolve tension, and redistribute responsibility. The repetition ensures continuity. Change in ritual occurs slowly, usually in response to environmental shifts rather than ideological reform. The absence of missionary impulse is notable. There is no drive to spread belief beyond known boundaries. Doing so would make little sense in a world where other continents are unreachable. Belief systems are complete without expansion. This containment reduces conflict. Belief rarely becomes justification for large-scale violence because there is no external population to impose it upon. Art, storytelling, and music serve belief not as decoration but as transmission. Stories are structured to be remembered accurately. Details matter because they encode knowledge. A story that forgets how a flood behaved or when an animal migrates loses value. Accuracy is preserved through repetition and correction rather than written canon. Because belief systems evolve alongside environment, they incorporate uncertainty naturally. When conditions change unexpectedly, belief adapts. New interpretations arise. Old explanations are revised. This flexibility prevents crisis of faith in the modern sense. Belief is not shattered by contradiction. It absorbs it. Authority within belief systems is usually distributed. There may be specialists, elders, or custodians of knowledge, but their authority is situational. A person knowledgeable about weather holds influence during seasonal planning. Someone versed in conflict resolution leads during dispute. Power shifts depending on context. No single figure embodies ultimate truth. This fluid authority reduces dogmatism. Belief does not harden into rigid hierarchy easily because survival depends on responsiveness. When belief oifies, it becomes dangerous. Landscapes punish inflexibility quickly. This feedback loop keeps belief grounded because belief systems are inseparable from land. Displacement carries spiritual consequences. Moving away from familiar territory requires reinterpretation. Stories adapt to new locations. Sacred meaning is not portable without effort. This reinforces attachment to place and discourages unnecessary migration. The language of belief remains concrete. Abstract nouns exist, but they are anchored in action. Concepts like balance, respect, or harmony are not philosophical ideals. They describe observable states. A balanced system produces food and safety. An unbalanced one produces scarcity and conflict. This concreteness also affects how belief handles suffering. Hardship is rarely framed as punishment for abstract sin. It is understood as part of environmental variability. Response focuses on adaptation rather than blame. Meaning is found in endurance, cooperation, and learning, rather than moral judgment alone. Over long periods, belief systems accumulate depth rather than breadth. They grow complex internally without seeking universality. This complexity supports nuanced understanding of environment and society. Belief becomes a repository of experiential knowledge refined across generations. The lack of external challenge does not mean belief stagnates. Internal debate persists. Different interpretations coexist. Some fade, others gain prominence. Change occurs through lived experience rather than doctrinal schism. Children learn belief through participation rather than instruction. They observe rituals, hear stories, and experience consequences. Understanding deepens gradually. Belief is not imposed as a set of propositions. It is absorbed as orientation. Because belief systems are not abstracted, they resist being reduced to slogans. They do not lend themselves to simplification. This limits their misuse. Belief cannot easily be weaponized because it requires context to function. Detached from land and practice, it loses meaning. As societies mature, belief systems continue evolving alongside social complexity. New roles emerge. New challenges arise. Belief adapts to address them. It remains integrated rather than elevated above daily life. This integration shapes how people understand the self. Identity is relational rather than individualistic. A person is defined by connections to family, land, and responsibility rather than belief statement. Faith is lived rather than professed. The absence of comparison also affects humility. Without knowing other belief systems exist, there is no sense of possessing absolute truth in contrast to others. Belief feels obvious rather than triumphant. It is not defended aggressively because it is not threatened. As the thought experiment progresses, these landscape-born belief systems quietly underpin everything else. They influence governance, conflict resolution, technology, and art without announcing themselves. They are background rather than banner. At first, the encounter does not look like history expects it to. There are no grand fleets arriving all at once. No single moment where the world suddenly becomes connected. What happens instead is uneven, hesitant, and deeply confusing for everyone involved. Civilizations that have developed for tens of thousands of years, without comparison, do not immediately recognize one another as equivalents. The meeting is not framed as discovery. It is framed as anomaly. The first contacts, wherever they occur, begin at edges. Coasts, borderlands, islands that sit just close enough to tempt extended travel. People arrive carrying assumptions that have never been tested against an external human world. They expect unfamiliar landscapes, perhaps unfamiliar animals, maybe strange weather. What they do not expect is people who are clearly human, clearly organized, clearly living meaningful lives, yet structured by entirely different logics. Initial reactions are practical rather than philosophical. Language fails first. Gestures misfire. Social cues are misread. A sign of respect in one culture registers as threat in another. Trade, if attempted, proceeds cautiously, often aborting halfway through, because no shared understanding of value exists. Objects offered carry meanings that do not translate. A gift meant to signal alliance may be interpreted as tribute. A refusal meant to express restraint may be seen as insult, because none of these civilizations evolved with the expectation of external contact. There are no prepared categories for interpreting the situation. No doctrine explains who these people are supposed to be. No prophecy announces their arrival. Belief systems strain not because they collapse, but because they were never designed to stretch this far. The land has always been the ultimate reference point. Now suddenly, there is evidence of other lands producing other ways of being human. The psychological shock is subtle but profound. It is not fear alone. It is disorientation. The realization dawns slowly that the world is larger than assumed, not just in size, but in possibility. Practices that felt inevitable are revealed as contingent. Ways of organizing time, authority, belief, and technology are no longer the only ways that work. Early contact zones become laboratories of misunderstanding. People try to apply familiar rules to unfamiliar situations. Sometimes this works accidentally. More often it does not. Negotiation is slow because there is no shared framework for compromise. Each side assumes the other operates according to similar priorities, only differently expressed. It takes time to realize that priorities themselves differ. Technology complicates matters. Civilizations shaped without competition have developed tools optimized for their environments, not for dominance. When these tools appear side by side, they do not line up neatly on a scale of advancement. One group may possess sophisticated navigation techniques but lack metallurgy. Another may have advanced engineering but little interest in long-distance travel. The absence of a shared technological ladder makes comparison difficult. This difficulty delays outright conflict in many cases. Without a clear sense of superiority, aggression lacks justification. Caution dominates. Encounters are approached tentatively, often framed as exchange rather than conquest. Violence does occur, but it is usually localized, driven by misinterpretation or immediate resource tension rather than ideology. Over time, patterns emerge. Certain contact zones stabilize. Others fracture. Some groups retreat, deciding that engagement is not worth the disruption. Others lean into interaction, driven by curiosity, necessity, or strategic calculation. No single response dominates, because each civilization brings its own assumptions about risk and reward. Language adaptation becomes one of the first sustained challenges. Translation is not just about words. It is about concepts that have no equivalents. Some ideas resist translation entirely. Negotiators rely on analogy, gesture, and repetition. New pidgin languages form, but they are limited. Misunderstanding remains common, even as communication improves. As contact persists, belief systems begin to respond. Not all at once and not uniformly. Some interpretations frame the newcomers as distant kin. Others see them as products of entirely different cosmological processes. The idea that humanity has multiple centers of meaning unsettles assumptions. In some places, belief adapts by expanding its scope. In others, it contracts, emphasizing local truth more strongly in response to perceived dilution. Technology exchange begins cautiously. Tools that clearly solve problems spread more readily than abstract ideas. Practical innovations cross borders faster than philosophies. A method of water management is adopted. A material technique is copied. But integration is uneven. Technologies that disrupt social balance are resisted even if they appear efficient. This selective adoption prevents immediate homogenization. Civilizations do not suddenly converge. Instead, they borrow fragments, testing them against existing systems. Some integrations succeed. Others fail and are discarded. The pace is slow because each society evaluates change through internal criteria rather than external pressure. Power dynamics shift gradually. Some groups gain advantage through access to new resources or techniques. Others lose stability as established systems are challenged. Inequality increases in some regions as contact creates asymmetries. But these asymmetries do not align neatly with continent of origin. Advantage depends on compatibility between systems, not inherent superiority. Psychologically, the most profound change is the emergence of comparison. For the first time, societies see themselves reflected in others. This reflection generates questions that never needed asking before. Why do they organize leadership differently? Why do their beliefs emphasize other values? Why do their technologies prioritize different outcomes? Comparison introduces anxiety where none existed. Practices once taken for granted become subject to critique. Younger generations, exposed to alternatives, question inherited norms. Elders respond with caution, sometimes defensiveness. Social tension increases not because change is immediate, but because possibility is expanded. Identity shifts under this pressure. Being part of a civilization is no longer just about belonging to land and lineage. It becomes about distinction. People begin to articulate what makes them different, sometimes exaggerating contrast to preserve coherence. This can lead to rigidity. It can also lead to creative synthesis. Conflict evolves accordingly. Early violence tends to be accidental or reactive. Later conflicts become more structured as groups learn how others fight, negotiate, and retreat. War, where it emerges, becomes more destructive than before because it introduces unfamiliar tactics and technologies into systems not designed for them. At the same time, diplomacy develops. The necessity of managing ongoing contact produces new roles, new rituals, new protocols. Neutral spaces emerge. Exchange becomes formalized. Over time, a thin layer of shared practice forms. Not enough to unify civilizations, but enough to reduce constant crisis. Economies adjust. Goods once valued solely for internal use acquire external significance. Trade networks extend beyond continents. Scarcity shifts. Some regions become central nodes. Others become peripheral. This reconfiguration introduces dependencies that did not exist before, complicating autonomy. Culturally, art and storytelling respond quickly. New narratives attempt to make sense of the expanded world. Some frame contact as destiny. Others treat it as disruption. Hybrid forms appear. Styles merge unevenly. Purity becomes a contested concept. Belief systems face their hardest test not from contradiction, but from coexistence. The realization that others live meaningful lives under different assumptions forces re-evaluation. Some beliefs universalize, claiming broader relevance. Others retreat, emphasizing exclusivity. Neither response resolves tension fully. Over generations, a new kind of historical consciousness develops. History is no longer purely local. Events elsewhere matter. Timelines begin to align imperfectly. People start to situate themselves within a larger human story, even if they disagree on its meaning. This expanded awareness reshapes ambition. Expansion outward becomes conceivable. So does restraint. Some societies pursue influence aggressively. Others focus on preserving internal coherence. The world does not move toward a single outcome. It fractures and reconnects in complex patterns. Technological acceleration increases in some regions as comparison introduces competitive pressure. In others, resistance strengthens. The quiet adequacy that once guided innovation is challenged. Not everywhere and not uniformly, but enough to alter trajectories. The emotional landscape shifts as well. Wonder coexists with grief. Something is gained through connection. Something is lost through the end of isolation. The certainty of a complete world gives way to the uncertainty of a shared one. No civilization remains unchanged by contact, but none dissolves entirely either. Each carries forward its prior logic. Now under strain, now in dialogue, now in conflict. Adaptation continues, but the variables multiply. What becomes clear over time is that meeting does not produce resolution. It produces complexity. The world becomes messier, louder, more interconnected, and harder to predict. The closed systems that once allowed civilizations to evolve inwardly open, not all at once, but enough to ensure that nothing will ever again develop in complete isolation. Somewhere after the noise settles, after first contacts stop feeling new, and before any single pattern hardens into inevitability, a quieter awareness begins to take shape. It does not announce itself through treaties, borders, or shared calendars. It emerges slowly, unevenly in conversations, in stories retold with hesitation, in moments when comparison gives way to reflection. The realization is simple in form and heavy in consequence. Humanity has never been one story. It has always been many unfolding at once on the same planet. In this world, where continents grew apart long enough to raise civilizations without reference to one another, the meeting of those civilizations does not collapse their differences into a single narrative. Instead, it reveals just how contingent every way of living has been. What once felt natural now appears situational. What once felt universal is revealed as local. This does not invalidate any civilization's history. It reframes all of them. People begin to notice this not through philosophy, but through experience. A tool that works beautifully in one place feels unnecessary in another. A social custom that ensures harmony in one society produces confusion elsewhere. A belief that feels obvious at home feels strangely incomplete when carried beyond familiar land. These encounters do not immediately produce synthesis. More often, they produce pause. That pause matters. For the first time, civilizations accustomed to being complete worlds encounter the fact that completeness was always partial. Not in a diminishing sense, but in a contextual one. Each civilization was whole within its boundaries, because it only needed to answer the questions posed by its land, climate, and history. Now new questions appear, not because old answers were wrong, but because they were never designed to address this scale. The idea of a single human trajectory becomes difficult to sustain. Timelines refuse to align cleanly. Developments that occurred early in one place appeared late in another or not at all. There is no clear sequence to point to. No universal ladder of progress. Attempts to construct one feel forced because they require ignoring too much. As a result, the language of comparison begins to shift. Early encounters focused on difference as deficit or advantage. Over time, this framing proves inadequate. It cannot explain why societies optimized for balance persist, where others optimize for expansion struggle. It cannot explain why technological restraint in one place produces resilience, while technological acceleration elsewhere produces fragility. The vocabulary of better and worse starts to feel blunt. Gradually, another way of speaking emerges. Instead of asking which civilization is more advanced, people begin asking what problems each civilization learned to solve well. Instead of ranking outcomes, they examine trade-offs. Instead of assuming convergence is inevitable, they recognize divergence as a natural response to different constraints. This shift is uneven. Some societies cling to hierarchies of value because they offer certainty. Others experiment with pluralism because it offers flexibility. Tension persists between these approaches. There is no global consensus, and none arrives quickly. But the possibility of seeing difference without immediately trying to erase it takes root. Memory plays a central role here. Civilizations with long internal histories draw on those memories to interpret the present. They recall times when systems failed because they ignored limits. They remember adaptations that preserved continuity. These memories temper reactions. They slow down impulses toward domination or assimilation. At the same time, memory can harden. Some groups idealize their past as proof of superiority. Others retreat into nostalgia as a defense against uncertainty. The same depth that provides wisdom can also produce rigidity. There is no guarantee that long memory leads to openness. It only provides material for interpretation. Across continents, art becomes one of the first spaces where multiplicity is acknowledged without immediate resolution. Stories are told that do not attempt to unify experience, but to place narratives side by side. Songs carry rhythms unfamiliar to local ears, but recognizable as meaningful. Visual forms incorporate motifs from different landscapes without fully merging them. Art becomes a way to hold difference without explaining it away. Language adapts again. New words emerge not to label others as exotic or foreign, but to describe the experience of encountering other valid ways of being. Translation improves, but it never becomes perfect. Some concepts remain untranslatable, and over time, this is accepted rather than lamented. The limits of language become part of shared understanding. Belief systems undergo quieter transformations. Few abandon their inherited frameworks entirely. Instead, they stretch. Some beliefs expand their scope, allowing multiple origins of meaning. Others narrow their focus, emphasizing local responsibility rather than universal truth. In both cases, belief becomes less about certainty and more about orientation. The idea of humanity itself shifts. Previously, humanity was defined implicitly by familiarity. To be human was to live as we do here now. With contact, that assumption dissolves. Humanity becomes a broader category defined less by shared customs and more by shared capacity for adaptation, memory, and meaning-making. This definition is thinner but more inclusive. Governance struggles to keep pace with this conceptual change. Political systems were built to manage internal complexity, not planetary plurality. Attempts at large-scale coordination often falter because they underestimate difference or overestimate shared priorities. Cooperation occurs, but it is fragile and situational. There is no stable global order, only overlapping agreements that shift as conditions change. Technology accelerates in some areas and slows in others. Comparison introduces new pressures, but not everywhere. Some societies embrace competition and innovation aggressively. Others double down on restraint. The result is not convergence, but increased variance. The world becomes more uneven, not less. This unevenness produces ethical questions that cannot be resolved universally. Is intervention justified when one society's practices cause harm beyond its borders? Who decides what counts as harm? Does technological capability imply responsibility? Does restraint imply negligence? These questions resist simple answers because they arise from incompatible assumptions about value. Individuals feel this tension most acutely. People who move between civilizations experience identity as something fluid rather than inherited. They carry multiple frames of reference. They see strengths and weaknesses in each. This can be disorienting, but it can also be generative. New forms of belonging emerge that are not tied exclusively to land or lineage. At the same time, many people choose rootedness. They reaffirm attachment to place and tradition, not out of ignorance, but out of preference. The existence of alternatives does not automatically diminish the value of continuity. Choice introduces responsibility, and not everyone seeks that burden. Education reflects this divide. Some systems emphasize comparative study, exposing students to multiple civilizational logics. Others focus on deep immersion in local knowledge, arguing that understanding one system well is better than understanding many poorly. Both approaches have merit, and neither resolves the tension entirely. Over generations, a subtle shift occurs in how history is written and remembered. Histories become plural. No single narrative dominates completely. Events are recorded from multiple perspectives. Contradictions are preserved rather than smoothed over. This complicates understanding, but it also reduces the illusion of inevitability. The idea of destiny loses coherence. When civilizations develop independently and then meet, it becomes difficult to argue that any single outcome was preordained. Paths appear contingent. Accidents matter. Choices matter. History feels less like a march and more like a web of intersecting trajectories. This realization introduces humility, but not uniformly. Some embrace it, others resist it fiercely. The struggle between certainty and openness becomes one of the defining dynamics of this shared world. There is no resolution in sight, only ongoing negotiation. Environmental awareness also deepens. Seeing how different civilizations interacted with their landscapes over long periods highlights the consequences of various approaches. No single model proves universally sustainable. Success depends on alignment between practice and place. This reinforces the idea that solutions cannot be transplanted wholesale without adaptation. As climate shifts affect multiple continents simultaneously, the need for cooperation becomes clearer. Shared problems demand shared response. But shared response does not mean identical action. Coordination must account for difference. This is difficult, slow, and often frustrating. But isolation is no longer an option. Through all of this, a quieter question persists beneath louder debates. It is not about governance, technology, or belief alone. It is about self-understanding. Who are we when we're no longer the only version of ourselves we know? This question does not demand an answer. It reshapes behavior simply by existing. It encourages listening. It complicates judgment. It slows certainty. It reminds humanity that meaning has always been constructed within limits, and that expanding those limits does not erase meaning, but multiplies it. The planet once experienced as several separate worlds now reveals itself as one shared space, containing many ways of living well and many ways of failing. No civilization can claim total authority over what it means to be human. No single story can encompass all others without loss. What emerges instead is a fragile dynamic coexistence. Sometimes cooperative, sometimes conflictual, always unfinished. The story of humanity becomes less about arrival and more about navigation. How to move forward without erasing where one came from. How to learn without flattening difference. How to share a planet without insisting on sameness. This is not a conclusion. It is a condition, one that continues to evolve as interactions deepen and histories intertwine. The quiet question does not go away. It follows humanity into every negotiation, every exchange, every attempt at understanding. And perhaps that is its value. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a reminder that civilization was never a single path, never a unified voice, never a finished design. It has always been an ongoing conversation shaped by land, memory, and choice. Now widened to planetary scale, asking not what humanity should become in one voice, but how many voices it can hold without losing the ability to listen.